Okay. Well, welcome everybody to the October 29th, 2020 BDAC meeting. This is the first day of a two-day meeting that we'll have this week. And unfortunately, we are still remote, but as Justin said, it's raining in DC, so maybe that's, maybe a blessing in disguise. But I'm still glad to see so many of you, if only on the screen. And I have fondest wishes that you and all of yours remain healthy in these difficult times. I'd like to start first by recognizing all of the hard work of the BDAC members during this challenging time. I mean, the committees continued to meet. People did the yeoman's work getting these reports done by October so they could present them this meeting. And I want to just say your efforts really make a difference, and that's evidenced by the 3 reports and recommendations that will be presented today. So as we all know, COVID-19 made very clear the importance of broadband, and it's even more evident when we look at the outstanding role that broadband has played during this crisis and in keeping America running as we fight the pandemic. I'm going to run through some quick ground rules because we are virtual and it is a different platform than we used in the past. First, please keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking. You may be on camera if you want, but it's okay if you don't want to be. That is different from our prior vehicle where you should not be on camera. In this case, please do. It's great to see your faces. Second, if you have a question or would like to make a comment during the designated discussion times, please raise your hand electronically and I'll call on you. I think there's a little hand at the bottom of the screen. If you will raise your hand, I'll call on you, and Justin will help me keep an eye on when people are raising their hands. But please don't try to just jump in and speak because it'll be hard to have an orderly discussion online that way. Third, you'll be hearing about proposed final report and recommendations from all 3 working groups. After the discussion, the BDAC will have a choice whether or not they want to vote to accept those reports or take other actions. If the BDAC decides to vote on the item, the voting will be held this way. You have a chat function on Teams. After a motion and a second on a report, I would ask each member to vote, and after discussion, each member will need to vote aye or nay in the chat. And that way we'll be sure to have an accurate record of who voted for what. And then I think that's everything. And since the chairman is already here, I would like to turn it over to Chairman Pye for remarks. But first, I and so many of you have had the honor of serving on this BDAC since Chairman Pye first created it in 2017. And I am very excited that he can join us today. Mr. Chairman.
Oh, good morning, and thank you to our illustrious chairwoman, Elizabeth Bowles, for that kind introduction. And like her, I hope all of you and your loved ones are staying safe and well during these unusual times. It's only been a little over a year since I spoke to you at the BDAC last June 2019, but it certainly seems like an eternity given all that we've been through in the time since. And so I want to thank all of you, as I always do, for your dedicated work, but especially over the last several months, when I know that you, like all of us, have been balancing the pressure of work life and home life. And I hope that the next time I see you, it's going to be in person. It's great to see you on the screen, of course, but there's no substitute, I think, to seeing you in the flesh and hopefully in our new digs, in the FCC's new headquarters. But I do think it's fitting that we are meeting just before Halloween, because I think it's pretty frightful for a lot of people to have to think about life without broadband. As Elizabeth pointed out, it's become more important than ever, especially for those who have kids who are studying at home or people who have jobs that require them to work at home, to want to be able to do telehealth at home so you can access healthcare remotely and safely. All of this requires a broadband connection. And you have always stepped up to the challenge, and certainly you've done that over the last several months. One thing I think that is clear is that the BDAC's work has been just incredible in terms of the reports and recommendations that you've created. For example, you've prepared broadband in terms of preparing broadband networks for physical disasters and now pandemics, including steps that stakeholders can take to ensure that broadband continues to be available for American consumers. Also, recommendations on increasing both deployment and adoption among low-income individuals. Also helping us to create a robust and dynamic broadband infrastructure workforce, including recommendations to eliminate the skills gap to help get people back to work. And this is sometimes a critical bottleneck given the difficulty of these jobs and the scarcity of the workforce needed to meet that challenge. I also want to thank in particular the chair, Elizabeth Bowles, as I mentioned, and the vice chair, David Young, for their continued service. It's been almost 4 years since the BDAC was stood up, and you've really led the charge all the way with aplomb, and I want to thank you for that. Tremendous leadership and knowledge and the ability to herd the cats, as it were, both in the real world and now, of course, in the virtual world, which is no small feat. Also, to help shepherd through the working groups, which have produced 4 fantastic reports for our consideration. And speaking of the working groups, I want to recognize their excellent efforts as well. I know that a lot of work gets done on that level. And in particular, I want to thank Red Grasso and Jonathan Adelstein from the Disaster Response and Recovery Working Group, Leticia Latino, who I see, and Rick and Tucker for the Broadband Infrastructure Deployment, Job Skills, and Training Opportunities Working Group. As I mentioned, workforce is a critical issue for us. And also Tom Free and Claude Aiken for the Increasing Broadband Investment in Low-Income Communities Working Group. It's kind of interesting, isn't it, how each of those working groups fits so well into the mosaic of connectivity issues that we're struggling with during the pandemic. And so your work is really more important than ever, cliched though that may sound. One of my biggest goals as chairman has been to increase broadband deployment and to help close that digital divide. And in that connection, as you might know, we are starting just this morning with bidding in the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund Phase 1 auction, a $16 billion initiative to get high-speed, high-quality broadband up to 10.25 million Americans. And really excited to see how that initiative bears out. It's our biggest step yet to close that digital divide. But you too are doing work along this front even today. The 3 export reports that you're going to be considering go to the heart of 3 of the issues that we need to resolve in order to ensure ubiquitous broadband access and adoption. And I know that hundreds of meetings and hours went into the production of those reports, and you should know, and I hope you do, that will make a major and positive difference in the lives of American consumers. When I first spoke to you back in 2019, I said that these issues might not be on the front page every day, but they have the real potential to transform people's lives. And that potential still remains, except that now it really is on the front page. Broadband is on the front of everybody's mind. And so I think that this will really help, the work you're doing will really help inform the commission, state and local governments, other federal agencies, the entire American public about ways that we can help address these connectivity challenges. Now, the second BDAC, of course, has been a fitting sequel to the first, unlike most sequels you see in Hollywood, but you're not done yet, of course. I look forward to monitoring the debate and reading the final reports when they are adopted. So I don't want to overstay my welcome and you filibuster in the grand tradition of Washington officials, but simply to say thank you once again to everybody who's worked on the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee. I know that as a lot of work has gone into your labors over the last couple of years, last few months, and on behalf of the FCC and the American people, thanks for all that you have done. So I'll just turn it over to our illustrious chair once again, and appreciate the support.
Thank you, Chairman Pai. That's the very kind remarks, and I personally have enjoyed my work with the BDAC over the last 4 years greatly, but the best part of it has been working with so many fantastic people who have put in so much fantastic effort to deliver this work product, and I'm very much looking forward to the reports that we hear today. Thank you for coming. So with that, I am going to turn the meeting over to Red Grasso and Jonathan Adelstein for our first presentation on the Disaster Response and Recovery Working Group report and recommendations. Red?
Great. Chair Bowles, thank you so much. I've got my camera on for just a minute, just so I can say hi to my adoring fans. I will turn it over to our PowerPoint, though. Make sure I've got my share settings correct.
Looks good, Red.
Make sure that I'm on presentation mode. Okay. My title screen is there, yes? If someone could verify that they're seeing just the slide
it is
there.
Yes,
Okay, great.
That's good.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate it. I am pretty excited that the Disaster Response and Recovery Working Group report is scheduled today during No Shoes Thursday rather than tomorrow on No Pants Friday, which is also known as No Camera Friday. Today, I wanted to go through the highlights of our report, not to insult anybody's reading abilities, but to provide an overview of our report, especially for our public viewers that may be following along from home. I just have to say hi, Mom. And this will be followed by a discussion led by Chair Bowles. First, I'd like to turn it over to the working group vice chair for opening comments. Jonathan, please.
Well, thanks, Red, and thanks for all the hard work you put into this. You've really address this great challenge that we all face as our chairman, and did an extraordinary job of pulling us together. You know, the chairman talked about it, the chairman of the FCC and our group, that this pandemic has influenced us all so much and changed how we work and live. And broadband has never shined like this before. Imagine, you know, what would have happened 10 years ago when the average wireline speeds were like 4 megabits per second. You'd have no Zoom, no remote learning for kids. We could barely work from home, if at all. And, you know, the economy and our way of life would have really collapsed. You talk about a real depression. You know, instead, I think we take it for granted a little bit, even with the light shined on broadband, that thanks to the investments that we've made and the progress that we've made, millions of us, certainly those of us here on this call, but millions of Americans have transitioned so quickly to working from home, going to school from home. But, you know, while that happened, the industry had to shift traffic over. I mean, from urban cores to and office parks to suburban areas. And all that was done without a hitch. And of course, the pandemic dramatically affected the needs of emergency services, hospitals, medical professionals. A lot of places around the country saw their emergency rooms overflowing, and starting to happen again as these cases were mounting. And that meant that medical professionals relied on these broadband connections to deliver care. You know, people dialed into countless telemedicine sessions to determine if they needed to go to an emergency room or if they could continue to stay home or to deal with other medical issues. So, you know, as I said before, when we first started this, I mean, wireless has become a literal lifeline. It truly can determine life or death. So we took this challenge as a working group extremely seriously. And I have to thank Chairman Pai for his vision in charging us to continue to work from that first report. You know, we had our first report and it was about preparing for the unexpected. And suddenly with the pandemic, we're constantly living with the unexpected. We're trying to figure out in real time how to keep our communities connected while this virus was spreading. And I'm so proud of the work we've done. It's a tribute to Red and the entire working group that this was a consensus process. Again, I was thinking back to when we began, and the first thing I said was, we need to make this a consensus. And we're going to operate on that basis, and we did. That goal was accomplished here. And I think, you know, the chairs of the full committee set the example. Liz Bowles and David Young, thank you both. So much work from our subgroup heads, Teleworking Challenges, Todd Gord and David Hartshorn, and the subgroup B, Municipal Challenges with Andrew Alferbach and Tony Fisher, and subgroup C, Provider Challenges with Kayla Gardner and Melissa Slauson. You know, we really, I think, saw Kurt Jacobs do an enormous amount of work on this. You know, I'd like to thank the drafting committee too, as after all that work was done, the drafting committee really did the yeoman's work in putting together the report. Amazing dedication and diligence. A lot of credit goes to Michael Romano and Chris Anderson, who led the editors group. We saw them really working hard, pulling together all these different sections from so many different people and managed to blend it all into a top quality final product. And also want to give a shout out to Mathis, who's interning with the FCC this semester, who did a lot of the site checking and made sure all those footnotes were formatted. Today, you know, I want to think again about how the industry's perspective on this. I mean, you'll see in the report that the pandemic shone a light on broadband and wireless. I think there is a wave of realization about how important they are now, that people are realizing the backbone of connectivity. And, you know, we talk in the report about how the network performed well overall. Again, you take it for granted, but it took a lot more effort than it might appear on the surface. That broadband providers had to shift resources quickly to handle all the transitions and the amount of data being carried on network and in different areas, such as I mentioned, you know, from urban cores to more residential and suburban areas. And within just a few days, the traffic patterns were changing dramatically from, you know, one of the studies we cite notes a 24.3% increase in voice traffic and a 19.6% increase in data traffic overnight. One wireless provider saw 86% increase in subscribers connecting to cell sites only in their primary location. So that shows that customers were not only accessing wireless networks, but they were doing it from their homes. And we saw a lot of decreases in mobile handoffs. So people were stationary, but they were working, using these networks in new ways. And, you know, there was challenges that came with that. Even though I think most consumers saw it as being seamless, industry was really having to work hard to keep up and offer the continued reliable network that people were relying on more than ever before. And it shows that I think our partners in local government also stepped up. You know, they had to continue performing their responsibilities, and they were being called upon to perform their jobs just as all of us were, helping out the departments during this crisis. And the whole effort, if we step back and think about it, began at that BDAC meeting. I remember as this pandemic was just beginning, we had to go virtual, and we were starting to see a lot of understandable issues with municipalities, just like all of us, facing a lot of hiccups, getting siting done to address emergency needs. And, you know, they were shutting down like the rest of us. They were moving online and working from home and taking offices that they'd been in for many decades and taking it on the road. So, you know, our partners in local government, like Nancy Warner, who's on the call I see from NATOA, agreed to roll up our sleeves and work together to try to address any concerns as they were rising in real time. We convened discussions with NATOA and NLC, local government reps jumped in, and the industry found ways that we could work together to keep communities connected. And as a result of BDAC, I think representatives of state and local governments built on that. We were collaborating together, and based on that collaboration, the NLC and NATOA published a resource that addressed the initial issues that were being faced with telecommunications permitting. And that joint effort, I think, led to a lot of improvements. We've really seen things turn around. You know, the way that industry and local government worked together was, I think, a model going forward. And the FCC was a model too. They did everything they could to support broadband providers as we were trying to keep people connected. The FCC made special temporary licenses for carriers available to meet the additional demand. More than 800 companies like ourselves, the WI, and many of our members signed the pledge that was initiated by Chairman Pai, which also got everyone to agree to extend it during the summer. And our members, you know, responded. We kept our families, our hospitals, our first responders, our businesses connected, and we're going to continue collaborating, just as we did on this report. I mean, this report is a great work product. It shows the best of what we can do when we come together during a crisis. We have great recommendations here, amazing data, analyses that will, I think, inform governmental processes, industry best practices, and partnerships going forward. You know, we think about how bad this was and how readily we stepped up and met the challenge. But you think about another pandemic that could be 10 times, 20 times more morbidity, mortality, more fatalities occurring, where we're really unable to even move, and we wouldn't be able to again live without broadband. And when things get worse, people are going to look, if they ever do, God forbid, at this report and say, what can we do? How can we do even better? So the vision of the FCC in charging us to do this, the incredible leadership of Red Grasso in pulling this together and keeping us all in line, moving forward, achieving a consensus. All the amazing members of this working group really did a lot of work. Well, they were extremely busy trying to keep up with their day jobs. I appreciate the volunteer effort that went into this, and this work is so important, and we'll never know until we really need to rely on it again, and hopefully we won't have to on a regular basis, but we need to build on what we learned, and this report is a real testament to what we can do together, and it gives us a guidepost going forward. So Red, I'll let you get to presenting the report. Thank you so much for your leadership.
Jonathan, thank you. I couldn't have said it better myself. I really do want to highlight several things that Jonathan makes a point to, one of which, first off, being that we had such a great team, and I'm humbled to be the voice presenting this. But as you all well know, as committee members, our working group was volunteer, and the people on board just did a tremendous job in producing this. Just to level set, I'm going to break some of the presenting rules and read a little bit from this slide, but just to make sure that we review the charges that we had from the FCC, paraphrase a little bit. I know this text is a little bit small, but the working group was to prepare a report documenting various strategies and solutions that stakeholders developed and implemented dealing with deployment-related challenges presented by COVID-19 pandemic. Specifically, we had kind of 5 charges before us, challenges associated with shelter in place and stay-at-home environments, useful responses to mass teleworking, including steps that can be taken in advance, best practices with regard to permitting challenges, including those caused by physical closure of municipal offices, shift to telework for municipal employees, and other complications. Number 4 is steps providers have taken to successfully address the physical impacts of the pandemic on broadband providers, including increased demand for bandwidth, limited staff availability, and limited ability to perform installations, maintenance, and repairs. And number 5 was ways that technology could be used to mitigate these and other similar challenges in the future. The full charges are available in our report. Jonathan highlighted our subgroup organization, and it doesn't go without saying that a huge thanks to our subgroup leaders. Our working group did organize into subgroups, not so much as a way to divide and conquer, but really as a way to focus and conquer, so that we could have meaningful conversations focused on one area and make the best use of our volunteers' times. Subgroup A really kind of focused a little bit on the charges number 1 and 2, which we sort of just grouped together and called it focus on the end user experience. That was led by David Hartshorn and Todd Gord. Subgroup B focused on our public sector, a little bit on for charge number 3 regarding municipal permitting challenges, but the public sector as a broader overview. That was led by Tony Fisher and Andrew Afflerbach. And subgroup C was focused on the provider's perspective, some of the great work that has been done on the provider side of things, being led by Melissa Slauson and Kayla Gardner. And then, of course, our editor subgroup that Jonathan mentioned, Chris Anderson and Mike Romano, pulling it all together for us. So I just want to highlight the leadership that we had there. We did, of course, produce a first report. That report was considered kind of an all hazards report for disaster response and recovery. We did take a look at that report in relation to this one. And we did find kind of 5 recommendations from that report that really apply. So I just want to call out some of those recommendations from the first report. I won't go into detail on those. We did not spend a lot of time discussing these recommendations since they are covered in our first report, though you may see some similarities where we pulled some of these recommendations and really fine-tune them as it related to COVID. So our key findings, the 4 key findings that we really had called out in our executive summary. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail during today's presentation on this. But overall, the networks performed well during the pandemic. Availability and adoption challenges were intensified. Municipalities were able to ensure that permitting generally was not an obstacle. And the national response to the pandemic prompted rapid and significant social changes that will likely lead to long-term changes in broadband usage and adoption. So going into a little bit more detail, networks performed well overall. We saw usage increase quickly and substantially. Location of usage shifted, and by location, we saw not only a location of the home instead of at the office, but in some instances, we saw location change from maybe a primary residence to a secondary residence or a vacation home. Some of those places may be in more rural areas, so that usage did sort of impact the modeling for broadband usage. Of course, video conferencing and other applications shifted those demands. We're seeing that even today during our committee meeting. High performance in the network really resulted from several key factors that we found. Continuous investments made by the providers, network engineering to handle the peak demands, technology advancements that really helped to minimize some of these impacts, and of course, additional spectrum made available by the FCC. We'll go into that a little bit later. Availability and adoption was really part of a lot of our conversations. The availability, of course, is the lack of connectivity for users to participate in needed teleworking or remote learning functions. And then, of course, adoption, we categorize as the circumstances in which connectivity exists, but the user does not subscribe. A little bit more into adoption, we found that some of the factors in adoption was the monthly cost of the service, the cost of an internet-capable device, knowledge of how to use increasingly complex devices and services, as well as the lack of relevance from the user's perspective. We did see that relevance was being questioned by many users in light of the pandemic as more governmental functions shifted to online, family visits were or are being conducted virtually, and work is being performed remotely. So it's very interesting to think about the user's perspective and how that has simply shifted during the pandemic. This was a great chart. You'll see it in our report, but overall, in terms of millions of people, this is based on the current definition of broadband speeds and census block level mapping that essentially 201 million Americans have it and 126 million that don't. One of the things about the prior chart is it's important to understand in the conversation that an increased availability increases the need to adopt, increases the need to address the adoption. As the pandemic presented a change in adoption criteria with government functions that went solely online, creating a new need, more data being used by more people from the same location, and of course, identifying the need for funding to address availability and adoption. In that conversation, we recognized that an increase in availability for unserved areas increases the need to address that adoption issue. So on the previous slide, you'll see that it shows 18 million are unserved, 108 are not adopted. If we shift the 18 million from unserved into a served population, that may not translate directly to an adopted population. So we need to make sure that in that shift, that adoption also gets addressed. And of course, in identifying funding, we did have conversations and recognized that one-time funding is important, but it's also just as important to address any recurring funding needs that may need to take place. In government continuity, we found some examples of local government hurdles, some changes to our public meetings that needed to take place as public meetings shifted to online. Some of the ordinances, some of the laws needed to kind of adjust to that. Some of those challenges, including allowing electronic signatures, having such teleconferencing for public meetings, allowing PDF copies to be accepted of certain applications. And then in that government continuity, we saw some very big wins with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency of the Department of Homeland Security, releasing guidance, as well as the National Coordination Center for Communications, or NCC, continuing to do the great access letters that they've provided since Hurricane Katrina. We found that continued work was very important during COVID-19, and having such a coordinating body focused on communications, which includes partners such as the FCC, Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, among several other federal agencies and private industry representatives was very important. CISA's guidance has been received well, and they should be commended for the work that they did in this newly formed agency. The valuable work that the NCC has been doing for several years can really serve as a model to CISA, as well as the working group feels that NCC's continue to provide an important collaboration point for the communication sector during the pandemic and beyond through the creation of this new agency. We have seen a lot of changes being prompted by this pandemic. We discussed remote work and distance education, as well as telemedicine changes. The long-term changes in office space and home office needs may not be fully realized quite yet. The pandemic is still ongoing. Sad to say that we are really kind of seeing a second wave. And a new normal is really hard to define. I think it was very insightful for the FCC to charge us with a deadline of October so that we can get this report done and kind of needed. Even though the pandemic is still ongoing, I think that there's a lot of great information here that can apply during this pandemic still. Specifically, diving into the last couple of slides here, I want to highlight the actual recommendations that we pull into our report. Sections 4, 5, and 6 are really the sections that detail this. I just want to highlight these recommendations. So 4.3.1, taking steps to improve broadband availability. Our recommendation is for Congress to take appropriate action for the additional funds needed to deploy broadband in unserved areas in a timely manner. 4.3.2 is to take steps to improve broadband adoption. Congress and the FCC should examine ways to enhance and improve the workings of programs such as Lifeline and other similar efforts. 4.3.3 is implementing distance education best practices. We recognize that we are not educators, but there are some best practices with regards to distance education, and schools really must make assessments among their students and teachers of the access to high-speed broadband and digital devices and their ability to pay for these service plans. 4.3.4 is implementing virtual workforce best practices. Businesses and governments have done a good job, continue to function most effectively and protect employees and customers in the face of this pandemic. These entities should consider and address these aspects, managing the virtual workforce in the future. Section 5 really deals with our recommendations on the public sector. 5.3.1, establishing non-emergency permitting practices that can transition. For example, online permitting processes and portals that will allow for a fully online acceptance, internal routing, review and issuance of permits, allowing electronic signatures and payment options, and then of course, staff, software, and hardware that may be needed. Identifying a champion or a point of contact in a municipality to handle the communications with the telecommunications industry is also important. 5.3.2, identifying necessary staff and resources to transition, creating a designated email address or portal to receive permit applications, considering drop boxes for permit applications, payments, or other documentation that cannot be submitted online, establishing best practices for inspections to continue, such as social distance requirements while inspections or meeting applicants, so that pre and post-work inspections may occur to verify pre-construction and as-built conditions. Consider working with applicants on requesting tolling agreements or some permits to suspend applicable shot clocks during the emergency to prevent violations or deemed granted permits, and identify staff necessary to support any online processes that as staff has hardware, software, and access necessary to work from home. And 5.3.3 is fostering those good relationships and communications with other stakeholders. Again, establishing a single point of contact at the municipality can be a very big win to ensure continuity. Canvassing city staff at the outset of such a pandemic to inventory what tasks can and cannot be done remotely, communication limitations to stakeholders, and work to identify alternatives. And clearly communicate whether an emergency or force majeure clauses are in effect for ordinances and municipalities. Often these types of provisions are not triggered by pandemics and similar emergencies. And 5.3.4, implementing steps prior to the pandemic or related emergency. The pre-incident preparedness and actions set forth in our section 5.1 really provides suggestions for actions that can be taken in advance for preparing for telework and municipal building closures. Section 6, I'll paraphrase a little bit. I know our eyes may be getting a little tired. 6.4.1, considering additional expedient use of special temporary authorizations. Again, the working group acknowledges the FCC's work to grant the use of additional spectrum to keep Americans connected. 6.4.2 addresses funding sources. We really feel that funding sources should remain flexible to address the root issues of availability and adoption noted in this report. The funds should not necessarily prescribe the solution, and some of the funding did come with rules or restrictions that may not have allowed the funding to address the root issue. So our recommendation is that the best solution for the issue should be allowable under the funding rules. 6.4.3, highlighting the effective communication and coordination with respect to access letters. The working group recommends the Department of Homeland Security engage more with state, local, tribal, and territorial personnel on access letter qualifications. Some of our SLTT partners may not have been familiar with the work that the federal government did as this pandemic hit areas that are fortunate enough to lack large-scale disasters. I'll highlight that just a little bit more. I think that some of our Gulf Coast states have been a little selfish in hosting a lot of tropical events this year. Some of our Western states have been a little selfish in hosting more than their fair share of large-scale, multiple wildfires. And as we dug into this topic, we really saw that some of our local governments, some of the states that don't have the pleasure of hosting disasters frequently may have been a little confused or a little blindsided by some of the recommendations that came out, some of the information coming from the federal government. So this highlights an opportunity to do a little bit more outreach as agencies deal with more disasters. 6.4.4, again, Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity, and Infrastructure Security Agency should continue supporting the communications sector through the NCC, and the NCC should continue to coordinate on communications sector preparedness and response with the Commission's Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, among other federal entities that they partner with. 6.4.5, implementing a more effective use of emergency support function number 2, which is communications. This deals a little bit with some of the emergency operations centers, and we do recommend that that function be stood up. It could be done virtually, maybe on a limited activation level, that follows normal business hours as a pandemic is very slow moving and may not need 24-hour coverage, but it establishes that point of contact and coordination that the telecommunications industry needs and making sure that things can be addressed due to the pandemic. 6.4.6, updating emergency and disaster response plans and activities. One of the aspects to highlight here is we did see some great examples. Particularly, there was one in Virginia from an Emergency Communication Center, or ECC, which we use the term ECC to recognize the greater, broader work that a public safety answering point, or PSAP, or 911 center is now doing. We did have a great example from an ECC in Virginia where they actually did remote work with their telecommunicators, answering and dispatching from their homes. And 6.4.7, continuing sound traffic engineering practices. We had some really great reports, and the working group wanted to highlight this as a recommendation, as in general, a lot of the networks had some great network traffic engineering that really allowed the networks to continue to perform well. And we highlight that as a recommendation for all of the networks out there to make sure that they're modeling. Charge number 5, if you remember all the way back at the beginning of my presentation, dealt with future technologies. And we really felt that future technologies stretched across all of our charges. And we really wanted to highlight it kind of in a separate section, as it is so important to make sure that we kind of look into that future. So there's a number of technologies that we wanted to highlight here. Some of them were definitely more on the engineering side. Some of them were just innovative ways. So we did highlight software-defined networking and network function virtualization. When I talk about a little less engineering side, although there is some aspect to it, we did highlight innovative ways that installation, customer self-installation, contactless repairs were being done. Artificial intelligence and machine learning became an important aspect, and it's very important for us to remain focused on as it advances, and technologies for additional capacity and connectivity. We also saw some pretty effective use of the wireless emergency alert system, particularly early in the pandemic, as shelter in place or stay at home or better at home orders were issued. The only other thing I wanted to highlight here was that we, as a working group, had some conversations about the supply chain being monitored, and we saw some really great public-private partnerships between the federal government and some industries. Overall, we did not see supply chain issues, but it is something to monitor going forward. There may have been some supply chain issues with smaller entities that lack some of the buying power of some of the larger entities. And overall, again, just a nod, the working group did feel that the Department of Homeland Security did a great job keeping up with industry, keeping industry up to date, and providing a forum to really report issues. In closing, I just wanted to kind of highlight, we had some great conversations in the working group about remote work and work from home terminology. So you'll kind of see that we separated off where work from home was appropriate in terms of some of the stay at home orders, and remote work as kind of a broader term for some of the work that was going on. This really is a collective effort, the excellent work from our members. We had a lot of specific examples from various industries, various agencies. We really wanted to try and highlight those, but we really brought it more broadly into the report So as you read the report and you may be missing some of the stories, we felt that we just wanted to highlight broadly and not necessarily dive deep into specific examples, though there are many from across the industry. I know that this work really touches a lot of the other working groups and their report, and so I really am thankful for the opportunity to be able to present this report to the committee, and I look forward to our discussions, questions, and comments. And with that long presentation, I will turn it over to Chair Bowles.
Thank you, Red, for a very informative and efficient presentation. You guys have done amazing work. So with that, I'm going to open this up to the BDAC for questions and comments. Please remember to raise your hand. And Justin's going to keep me honest. If I don't see your hand and you're on the video, like wave or something, and I'll call on you. But any questions, comments, thoughts? I am not seeing any. So I'm going to ask if there are no questions, comments, or thoughts.
Raise her hand. Elizabeth.
Oh, Leticia, great. There it is. Hi, Leticia. I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that.
Right.
Thank you, Justin, for seeing me. Thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity. I just couldn't let it go past without really praising the amazing work this working group has done. I was so impressed reading this new report and how many different aspects you were all able to identify. So congratulations to all of you. And then as a takeaway from the presentation, really, I think what resonated with me and the work that our workforce group is doing is the point about, we have to be very diligent about, we know when we increase availability or, of the service, we're gonna have to address the needs for adoption. I was personally blown away by the number that you reported, that 108 million have broadband available to them but haven't adopted. So I definitely think that that is the point to me that brought home the need to work together, all the working groups, but also to see how do we solve the issue of adoption.
Yeah, and I would second that. We have not done as much work in adoption as we have in some other things, although we did a little bit of work in the last BDAC round. I think it's a very good point that to discover why these people are maybe not adopting. Any other, oh, Chris.
Thanks. Yes, I just wanted to follow up on Red's bullet there about how municipal permits were, generally steadily issued throughout the pandemic. And just a shout out to Nancy Warner and NATOA. Under WIA, we collaborated with NATOA and the other municipal organizations, and it was some spirited discussion and representation on both sides, and really hammered through some things, and the permits. And I can tell you, I tracked ours daily nationwide, and they really steadily clicked right along through the pandemic, essentially without missing a beat. And I really appreciate Nancy's representation and collaboration working with us. I think it was just a model of a good outcome for all the parties. Thanks.
Thank you. Brian O'Hara.
Yeah, I just want to echo here what's been said and thank Red for his leadership. I think this has been a great discussion, and this has been a very good product, and I was very glad that Jim Matheson and I were able to be a part of this. So that's really all I have to say, and I think this is a great product. I look forward to the vote.
Anyone else or any other comments, questions, or thoughts? All right. Hearing none, I would like to see if the BDAC is ready to call this for a vote, and if so, I would welcome a motion.
So moved.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second. If there is no further discussion, I will call it to a vote. Please remember to vote in the chat window. Aye or nay. Larry, you are a rebel.
I'm sure many of you are experiencing this. I've got 3 devices and I'm getting multiple notifications of all this. So yeah, it's fun.
So I think, okay, they're coming in.
But you can only vote once, David. Remember that. And next week as well.
I'm receiving everyone's vote like 3 times.
Only 1 vote per person.
Don't fill it in.
Yeah.
In BDAC and life, only 1 vote per person. This is almost like popcorn, you know, it pops a lot and then it kind of slows down. There's just the 1 kernel and you're trying to time it exactly perfectly. I think we have most everybody. If you haven't voted yet, please do. I would like to congratulate the working group on what appears to be a unanimous passage of your work product. You all did amazing work. I was proud to be a part of it and thank everybody for your efforts. I am going to say that we're ahead of schedule. And as such, it's possible we may get through all working group presentations today. The TCI had sent you a text to see if you might be able to be ready this afternoon. But if so, we'll just try to roll through unless there are objections to that. We will see where we are after the next working group presentation. Okay. We do have remarks at 2 p.m. from Commissioner Carr. So we would expect that the TCI's group would go after that one. Hi, Tom. So I see you are ready. Are you ready? Okay, with that, I would like to introduce the report and recommendations from Tom Ferree and Claude Aiken, respectively Chair and Vice Chair of the Increasing Broadband Investment in Low-Income Communities Working Group. So with that, I will hand it over to Tom.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Vice Chair Young, thank you for allowing us to come before you today.
Tom's frozen. Oh no.
Claude, we may have to get Tom some broadband.
Yep. We'll work with one of our members to get him a better connection.
Do you have a whisk over there? Get somebody over to get him some broadband.
Underscores the need of robust connectivity across the nation, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Let's see.
Looks like Tom's coming back in now.
Okay, good. I always find it funny when I'm looking at a screen where somebody has the screen of everybody on it because everybody looks not like they normally do.
Chairwoman Bowles, can you hear me?
I can hear you. And I think we're looking at your screen.
We're like an entrance, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's stepping on the banana peel as you step onto the big stage.
I think get you some internet, so we're good.
Well, and hopefully I'm not buffering here, but I'm having some network problems, and we actually I just dropped the power. But anyway, I think we're back up and should be good. So I apologize for the inconvenience. I was going to say thank you, Madam Chair and Vice Chair Young, for allowing us to come before you today. I know you, Chairwoman and Vice Chair. It's funny. You all have the enviable position of having to be workers in everyone's subgroups. So I know how busy you are, and I know how glad you are to see your respective teams bring this over the line. So it's with great pleasure today that Claude and I will be representing the Increasing Broadband Investment in Low-Income Communities Working Group today. I also will be joined today, obviously, Scott Rudd, is the chair of our subgroup for the low-income adoption side. He is supported there with by Jordan Goldstein. I'm not sure if Jordan will be able to join us. He was going to be a little late to the presentation today. And Jeff Weiss from the Montana Telecom Association, who chairs our deployment team, I believe has joined us as well on the team's platform. I will beg your forgiveness on the front end. I am not as proficient with the team's platform as some of you are, so pardon the occasional glitch. But we are very glad and to put this work before you. I would also start by saying, we as a group had just really, I can't speak enough about the attendance. We met on a pretty regular cycle, and particularly since our last convening in July, turned up that frequency as we began to move into drafting efforts. I will say, though, even before that effort, we as a team had really come together and gelled in a pretty amazing way. And I think I just want to thank everyone who I was privileged enough to work with. The networking and the camaraderie and the bonding, and more importantly, the fact that we had such great experiences in learning and educating ourselves really has made such on a personal level, a great experience for me, Madam Chair. And so I thank you for the opportunity to lead that.
Hey, Tom, I hate to interrupt. Did you mean to share your desktop, or did you want to just share your presentation?
Well, I didn't know I had shared any of it, so I will let's see here.
Should be bottom of the screen, that box with an up arrow pointing up.
Yeah, like an arrow into the box.
You can unshare. Sometimes it's at the top after you've shared, Tom. Might say stop sharing.
It looks like on the top by the leave button, you have a box. I think if you hit that X,
yeah,
that might do it. Ironically, being able to see your screen might be helpful. Okay, so Claude's requesting control. So we'll give Claude the power.
Well, we'll see if we can make it work, and then we'll give it back to. I was hoping that would get.
There's a little screen with an X on it.
We lose him again. Oh, he's coming back in.
Hey,
So there's
Jeff, is it possible to take control and give it to Claude?
Hi. Come join the meeting. It's fun.
Yeah, it's not a new BDAC member.
Ooh, I like your doll.
Thanks, Jasmine.
Jasmine, I know. I recognize her. She's cool.
There we go.
Scared through OGC.
There we go.
All right, thanks everybody.
All right, Madam Chair, do you see our presentation?
I do.
Okay, I apologize for that slow start. I was about to, at that point, let me just be quick and get out of the way of further technology challenges here and recognize my great co-chair, Claude Aiken, for a few opening comments.
Sure, thank you, Tom, and I appreciate and will underscore your comments at the opening about how amazingly the group worked together. It's a tough issue a tough charge that we were given by the FCC, and I think the entirety of the group rose to meet that challenge in providing the report and recommendations that this great committee sees before it today. It's great to see in advance some of the work that we've done echoed up front on the adoption and deployment side by Red and Jonathan's group, and look forward to diving deeper on the low income side coming up. So I'll just keep it brief and say thanks for the opportunity to present.
Thank you, Claude. All right. Well, without further ado, we'll get started. And Justin, perhaps you can clean up the in the mix here at the post report here, the video challenges. I hate to be remembered in all posterity for the.
I think my daughter might want to use this as her starting off point for her, video career. So we might have a battle there.
That's right. That's right. Okay. Well, there's only way to go up from here. So, Madam Chair, I'm going to try to advance the slide here. Okay. So just by way of update of how we've been spending our last quarter since we last came together here in July, I would say, the main thrust of our activity and focus has been clearly in the synthesizing and drafting efforts that has been submitted, obviously, here at the end of the September 30th deadline for us. But in the course of that, we were able to take in a few other ones. We tried to obviously embrace nimbleness and a sense of agility in our study, and particularly, I recall back, our efforts had largely been able to probably tender a report to this full BDAC maybe back in the spring, but as COVID obviously enveloped all of our worlds, our particular group, and it's certainly not a claim to brag about perhaps, but in some regard, the low income working group was presented with such an unprecedented opportunity to study the impact, the unique impact that COVID presented for our work. And so if there is a silver lining, I guess that we got to see in live and sometimes painful expressions what COVID meant to these vulnerable communities and basically every facet of their lives. And so it was a sad to say, but I guess also benefiting a very enriching experience and learning opportunity. So similarly, we took that and embraced that even into our last 30 days worth of report drafting to just be a sponge and knowing that some of these stories and observation points present quite literally overnight, we wanted to take full advantage of that. In that spirit, gentleman Hal Wood, who is the chief of policy for Kids First Chicago, was able to really, as we got moving into the start of school season, many of you all have been tracking with the wonderful project that is going on there in the Chicago metropolitan area, entitled Chicago Connected. It provided a great case study for us to add to our other case studies inside the context of COVID rapid response. And so we took some time with Mr. Wood to understand his effort, and I think you will see a placeholder in our report for a more thorough treatment of a case study. As of the time of our meeting this morning, we are still waiting on final sign off from him for the proposed copy that we have put in front of him for the case study, and I hope that Madam Chair, we will have that soon and be able to incorporate that. I don't know that it substantively changes the report. It certainly serves more as an illustrative element, so I'm not sure that it would present any challenge for us to move action on any of our report findings today. Also wanted to just recognize from my team, Mr. Brent Legg, who is our Executive Vice President for Government Affairs, joined me formally as a designated alternate over the last quarter to really helping us put together some of our findings, or at least help me in synthesizing some of our work. Now, as I said, with COVID afoot, it certainly presented a lot of stimulus for action in our area of study. Included here, that half dozen or so federal bills that have just been introduced even since our summer period of study. In addition, this is anchored also by a number of state-based efforts that have been either energized or sometimes even in the case of many states initiated from dormancy as a mobilizing effort to address some of the concerns that the low-income communities have suffered through with COVID. There's obviously been a tremendous amount of COVID relief through some of the CARES Acts and other federal efforts to put money into the effort. And I think that all of us would agree that we have seen a pretty profound market entry for private sector and philanthropic foci on the digital divide in ways that haven't quite been as galvanized as in years past. So that has been something that I think has been pretty reassuring. Traditionally, a lot of those groups stay on the sideline when there is an abundance of public sector effort at a particular challenge. Having them come alongside this, again, unprecedented resource allocation has been something that I think has really been a bit of a unifying clarion call for all of us interested in closing the digital divide. I think as we look also, I want to also recognize, obviously, a huge one here. Forgive me for almost brushing over this. National Digital Inclusion Week. It was right that it would play here at the beginning of our season of final report production. Angela Safer and the NDIA group have been very accessible to our team for a number of discussions, and certainly we're glad to support their call for a National Digital Inclusion Week here at the beginning of October. And of course, even just this week earlier, the FCC's actions to establish the 5G Fund for Rural America and some of the increasing opportunities for unlicensed TV white spaces really just show the breadth of effort and some innovation and creativity that is coming to bear to solve this challenge for us. I think I would just leave you with, as we close out the third quarter and look now into the beginnings of our fourth quarter efforts. And Chairwoman, you obviously will set the pace and tempo as we move from this place. But some of the things that we know we need to still accomplish is the incorporation of any feedback. We obviously have put forward a pretty Spartan draft here. It's some of the cosmetics and the stylings are still to be completed after we have accounted for all of the different revisions and edits otherwise that you may bring forward today. So we will bring a nice cosmetic finish to that, a tightening of some of the orientation of the report. And also, Madam Chair, we would seek as a working group to leave behind not only the report, but some of the things that went into the report in the forms of lessons learned sessions and documentation that may serve to help future groups as they undertake kind of the forming and norming exercises of committee work. So we would certainly want to leave that in addition, albeit much more of an informal submission for consideration. Also, closeout activities, again, archival. Madam Chair, I would look for any direction that you would have as far as, or perhaps Justin, for any guidance that we might need to be considerate of as we look to wind down our more active phase of our work. Again, before we kind of get into our report, and that will be the thrust of our conversation, we have dispensed with some of the a lot of the orientation slides that we have employed in the past. I think we have seen them and are well aware of them. They are certainly well accounted for in the report itself. So our focus today will be to cut right to the meat and potatoes and get into the recommendations, as my colleague Red and Jonathan have already done. So, but it's appropriate and proper for us to remind ourselves of our working group charge. And so as you see them before you here, obviously, to identify the regulatory and other barriers that deter the development of high-speed broadband infrastructure and service to low-income communities, recommend actions to increase incentives to invest in deployment of high-speed broadband to low-income communities. Third, we've looked to identify the barriers to adoption and use of high-speed broadband service in those low-income communities. We further seek to recommend actions to increase broadband adoption and use among the low-income Americans, examining whether greater broadband adoption rates among low-income Americans would give providers strong incentives to deploy more broadband infrastructure in those communities. Fifth, to recommend best practices for states and localities to encourage deployment of high-speed broadband to low-income communities. and to encourage broadband adoption within such communities. And lastly, to examine and explain how the Commission should identify low-income areas where additional action or reform would be most would most increase broadband deployment. It's also worth noting here, also not explicitly in our charge, but clearly a bright line that was drawn for us at the commencement of our work was to not wade into Universal Service Fund programming alterations within the scope of our recommendations. Now, that is not to say, though, and with the support of the chair, that our efforts and focus did not necessarily or did not shy from examining those programs and their effect in the low-income communities, such that we would find complementary efforts or ways to maximize the existence of those programs. Indeed, to not bump up against that would have been dereliction or irresponsible behavior on our part. So that you will find references within our report. Okay, so let me orient you now, although you all have gone through the report, just as a reminder how we've staged our work. It was basically a play in 3 acts, an introduction, where we would take up again some of the more table setting objectives of the report, establishing our charge, making sure that there was a good accounting for all of our working group makeup and our resources, and that would extend to not only personnel, but our invited guests and subject matter experts, and of course, insights into the resource library that played and factored into our report production. Also, some of the catalyzing all that into a preamble was a good exercise, not only for us to get a mark on the wall, but also I think to serve as something of a bearing point for our work that we came back to a number of times as we were deliberating and moving through report production. I would highly recommend that as a best practice. It is a good center to come back to and make sure that we don't go too far afield from discussions and report findings. Definitions. You know, wherever we could, we certainly, at the insistence of Madam Chair and Vice Chair Young, we sought to build off of and incorporate definitions that had already been established by the former BDAC. So there are a few instances, particularly in the case of, we only had 4 definitions, by the way, broadband being one of them, the actual term for broadband. We did not stray from the formerly established definition, but we did perhaps expand on it in context. And so you will find that of all the definitions, that was probably the one that takes up the most real estate inside our report. But it was important to establish those things so that we were all speaking with a common vocabulary through the course of our work. From there, we moved into, we organized the back ends of our working group report into 2 sections. As has well been documented here, we took our charges, our 6 charges there, and began to look at them and bifurcate them across deployment and adoption orientations. And so that also began to form our straw man of how we would organize our work. And the deployment subcommittee report, obviously leading with that, as we would, without a network or the presence of a network, you don't have the case for adoption. So it made a perfect logical sense to stage that first in the report read. Within this section, you will find an overview of the digital divide from the deployment perspective. We also, at this point, this is probably the best area where we pick up some of the elements of how do we identify these communities, where do we find them, that calls for more publicly available open mapping data and a few other data recommendations, data sharing and data collection recommendations. We also, within this group, under Jeff Weiss's leadership, sought to establish a very clear and concise correlation between income and deployment. An element that you will find in both reports is the context of COVID-19. As I stated earlier, our working group as a whole, I think, had a high degree of relevance in connotation to the pandemic. And even within our low-income working group, it more prominently, I think, shone through our adoption side scope of study. And so you will find, while it is accounted for in the deployment section, the more substantive treatment of that pandemic impact is probably dealt with more inside the adoption group, which is the third part of our efforts there. And of course, each section concludes with the recommendations that each group has put forward. Briefly, as you saw in the report itself, the deployment subcommittee group has put forward 18 recommendations. We will be walked through those here briefly by Claude. Quick overview of those. That breaks down in this way. We had 13 general community deployment recommendations, and we had 5 that were specific to low income. So taken total would provide the universe of 18 recommendations. Now, you may ask, why would you go with anything but the low income community recommendations? And in the course of our work, we understood that even traditional community incentives and recommendations would have profound impact in those low income communities. So think of it more as a macro and micro level of recommendation. And so collectively, that is a rather large portfolio of recommendations that you will have found in our development subcommittee report. On the adoption side, we were able to drill in a little bit more to a more consolidated viewpoint on these recommendations. They are very, they're dense, they're very rich in their content, but we have consolidated those into 6 recommendations, Madam Chair, and I will be supported today in that review by Mr. Scott Rudd, who chairs our adoption subcommittee. It also is probably right here where I will want to recognize that, again, as you receive that report, understand that its intent is to give you a very non-distracted and Spartan view of our work. Again, some of the cosmetics and the stylings, and even perhaps some of the grammatical or typographical checks, you may find those in there, but those things will all be certainly cleaned up before there is a glossy cover page submitted to you, Madam Chair. I also want to say I just can't say enough about the team that helped put all this together, and not just in the drafting stage of it, but certainly from the inception of the committee's work, but in particular the last 60 to 90 days of really synthesizing this and getting it down to paper. I want to recognize a few personalities here that were just instrumental in that. Certainly our committee chairs, Scott Rudd and Jeff Weiss, and their supporting team of Jordan Goldstein on adoption, Anthony Leave from our adoption team, single-handedly, I think, served as our scribe and also just our conscience on the adoption side, and just did a wonderful job. And it's not as easy as it looks to take disparate ideas and even writing assignments and meld them in a way that shows some degree of coherency. But Anthony has worked some great magic there. Jeff likewise was supported in that same regard by Jane Builder, Claude Aiken, obviously, and Commissioner Karen Charles Peterson, Mark Marenti, and even our vice chair here, Mr. David Young. I did want to spend just one more minute before I turn it over to our subcommittee heads to take you through the recommendations and just remind us of the COVID context. I speak a lot of that, obviously, in the buildup of our recommendations. But again, I can't underscore enough how tremendous the opportunity to study in real time the things that we had looked at over the course of the last year and a half, to see it in a living lab play out as it did. It also served as the basis for the 3 case studies that you will find in the report, all call back to a context of COVID-19. And briefly, those fall in 3 areas. One was a case study in rapid response. This is a slide that I pulled forward from our last presentation because I believe it serves well to encapsulate that again. The tremendous response from the provider community in answering the call of Chairman Pai for the Keep Americans Connected pledge, lifeline and E-rate requirements, and the ability to make those programs as malleable as possible to accommodate remote learning, NTI, and some of the things that really gripped not only our spring, but certainly as a lot of the kids have faced uniquenesses as they've come back to education. here in the fall. Incidentally, education, I believe we would all agree, perhaps because of the nature of it involving children, for whatever reason, perhaps provided the most fertile field of COVID study inside the demographic of the low-income community. That's not to discount the impact in areas of telehealth for seniors or other unique nuances, but certainly education is one of those things that I think many of us can all relate to, even if we don't have school-age children. It's not too far from our memory bank to recall what those kind of unique challenges are that confront the low-income community. Of course, the CARES Act, that provided such an immense amount of fuel for states and localities to begin to fashion mobile response efforts as provided for by the federal government. And of course, several internet service providers taking it upon themselves to initiate their own programs, either independent of these aforementioned efforts or is collaboration with them. As I said earlier, the amount of diversity in the stakeholders that are coming together to address these things, public, private, philanthropic, you name it, it's truly been an all hands on deck. In some regards, it's almost been a challenge to try to inventory and account for all of them, Madam Chair. Okay, at this point, I would like to recognize for our adoption group, Mr. Scott Rudd, Lieutenant Governor Crouch's right-hand man in regards to all things broadband in the great state of Indiana. So Scott, without further ado, I'll advance the slides for you, but turn over the microphone.
Great, thank you, Tom. If I could, just on behalf of Lieutenant Governor Suzanne Crouch, thank the FCC for your rapid response to our needs as a state and a nation during the pandemic. I can tell you firsthand that when we asked for help, the FCC responded, whether it was clarifying rules for schools to serve students, providing millions of dollars through the CARES Act for serving those students with connectivity and devices, to telehealth enhancements, on and on and on, remote learning. Thank you for your partnership and your responsiveness during this intense time of need. As Tom said, we were charged with tackling the low-income adoption portion of our group's work. And the first recommendation you see on the screen there is addressing the issue holistically. And one of the things that came to mind immediately as I was putting this presentation together was this saying that many of you have heard, which is, give a person a fish and feed them for a day, teach a person to fish and feed them for a lifetime. You can draw lots of parallels there with the space that we're operating in, whether you're handing your grandparent or your parent a phone with the doctor already on the screen versus showing that parent or that person how to sign on, where to go, and teaching them how to take care of their own health moving forward. That's kind of what this issue is. This first recommendation is getting at. The pandemic highlighted that so effectively, and when we look at those numbers on adoption, low-income adoption, particularly some of the numbers that Red cited, it's surprising the number of people in our nation who have access but can't afford it. But maybe even more surprising to our group was the number of Americans who have access to fixed and wireless connections but choose not to adopt either. And so lots of challenges here and headwinds, but we think that addressing this issue of low-income adoption and those gaps that exist really is going to require the multiple prong approach, not just handing a device to someone if they can't afford service, or teaching them to use a service that they can't afford. It has to be all prongs and all hands on deck to comprehensively address some of our low income challenges with adoption. 2 and 3 deal with data and data sharing. We all know we have challenges and headwinds in terms of accessing, the most localized data possible and the most accurate data possible There are significant efforts underway. We know at the federal level to address some of our mapping issues, and I'll kind of gloss over those because I know Jeff and the deployment team have some significant recommendations on those fronts. Things like including utilization data, longitudinal studies, and adoption trend data, focusing on both fixed and mobile broadband. One of the interesting things we learned was, and you'll see this in some of our recommendations, was that a lot of the low-income folks, when presented the opportunity to opt into either a wireless or a fixed service, many of those folks choose the wireless or mobile service, I should say, for reasons we all, may understand. But one of the things we came to the conclusion of was that, both of those services are important. And in order to provide a full spectrum of service to any American, let alone low-income Americans, we need both options on that table to fully utilize and benefit from that technology. And so, focusing on those both fixed and mobile, and then breaking down information both geographically and demographically. When we look at the mapping and try to distinguish areas of low income, it becomes challenging when we look at the info that's available for access or where broadband is or isn't. And so overlaying those two becomes problematic, as you see in our report. And that's one of the things that we would recommend kind of improving on. On the data sharing front, we know there is data out there, and there are significant data sources that can inform our work and focus our work, whether we're at the federal, state, or local level. But when it comes to combining those data sources, sharing those data sources, that's where we see significant challenges. And quite frankly, we saw that during COVID, where there are confidentiality issues that may prevent certain data sets from being shared with an agency or a department that could greatly benefit from seeing that data and helping those same individuals. And so we have work to do in terms of sharing of data at all levels, including public and private. So promulgating that as a body of standards or best practices, and kind of guiding the nation top to bottom in terms of how we, whether you're a community doing surveys on low income adoption or a federal agency, how can we combine those efforts in a way that is more beneficial and more easily shared? The NTIA in-band map, recently Indiana joined that effort. That's one of the examples I can think of that does that and leads us in that direction. And I think we'd like to see more of that happening. Improving accessibility, a clearinghouse, and one-stop functionality. Speaking of the NTIA in-band map, comes to mind. If you could next slide there, Tom. There we go. Engagement and coordination. Fourth recommendation. Closing the adoption gap necessarily must involve efforts by all stakeholders in the public and private sectors working together. As Tom mentioned, this is going to take a comprehensive approach to solve all of these issues. It's more important now than ever to ensure that public sector efforts, including Lifeline and other programs, complement one another and are coordinated in a fashion, including among different levels of government, the federal, state, local, and departments, agencies, and others. How can we better engage and deploy those funds in a way that is more efficient and focused to the areas of need? COVID-19 rapid response successes really highlighted the value in broadly engaging community organizations, the nonprofit sector, schools, on and on and on. We saw this all over the nation, including in our state, groups coming together, identifying the immediate and pressing challenges, many of those focused on schools and telehealth for our seniors and others. The case studies shown there, Chicago Connected program is one of those examples. Thousands of students connected through a creative collaboration, private, public, and entities coming together in ways that we haven't seen in the past and getting the job done. So deepening that engagement, very important as a part of our recommendations. Improving affordability, it was mentioned earlier, the number of Americans who, cite affordability as an issue. One of the recommendations, is to improve that affordability with both demand side and supply side interventions, and things such as a subsidy, as we mentioned, a service subsidy that may afford an individual a connection is one of the things. On the supply side, increasing the number of providers in an area or improving competition. But again, we can provide service and find ways to provide service, but if that person and that individual doesn't have a piece of equipment or a device and is not doesn't possess the digital literacy skills to activate that device and take advantage of it, we have to take a comprehensive approach there. In terms of improving outreach, we know and learn through our work as a committee that many people who are eligible for the programs that could help them, are not aware of those programs, and we need to find ways, to make these adoption programs, more visible, and in many ways it's through that local, connection that may already exist, and for example, a library. Many of the folks who don't have connections go to a library for their connectivity and their digital literacy training, and so connecting with those institutions that have pre-existing relationships with this target audience, and using them as a conduit to improve outreach on the availability of these programs will be very important, I think, moving forward. With that, Tom, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Scott. And just to underscore that last point, I think a few things will benefit us as we emerge eventually from COVID-19, and that is obviously, I don't believe that anyone would argue that relevancy issue has probably been is about addressed as it could possibly be. So there is certainly a heightened sense of the need to go find these available resources aimed at low-income communities. So the consumer now is much more informed that these things exist. Whether that falls back, at least some of the inventory of these opportunities fall back after things become normalized again. But the awakening, if you will, that such opportunities exist, we hope that we can begin to, as Scott said, bring a consolidated and good, transparent view into what the particular opportunities are for a particular community to take advantage of. So again, that's probably some of that momentum that we hope to capture as a nation as we emerge from this. Thank you, Scott. Let me also now recognize Claude Aiken. Jeff Weiss is with us. He is the actual chair of the deployment subgroup, so he is available should we have questions at the end on these recommendations. But it's my pleasure to introduce Claude Aiken, our working group vice chair, to take us through this next section of our deployment recommendations. Claude?
Absolutely. Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it. And it's great to see the adoption and deployment really working hand in glove. And I think you'll see that as a theme throughout this presentation and throughout our recommendations. Again, I just want to thank Jeff in particular for all of the work that he has done to get this report to the place that it is today, as well as all of the very engaged members of the subgroup who have all played very key parts in making sure that we're thinking through all the issues as we need to, and from all the different angles that we need to. I think that's one of the great things that you see from the many different entities that are represented on this subgroup. Everyone brings a different perspective to how we can incent deployment in low-income communities. So if we can move on to the next slide. As Tom mentioned at the top, there are a number of recommendations. We've consolidated some of these in here in order to make it easier to focus on things a little bit more thematically. But as has been mentioned previously, and I think you'll see themes that have been already deployed and others that will be picked up later in other presentations, it's really going to take an all of the above approach to address the gap in low-income communities, both supply side, demand side. We need to look at all technologies, at all potential solutions in order to be able to really attack this gap. And this includes workforce issues. It includes public-private, private-private, and all manner of iterations based on those two kinds of partnerships that we'll need to see to address the deployment gaps in these communities. That's number one. We also talk about, again, this falls into the general recommendations, but state and local streamlined deployment-friendly policies. I think you heard Jonathan at the top of the meeting talk about the great work that localities have done to improve and streamline deployment. I think some of those examples that we have seen need to be driven forward in other communities that may be more challenged in some of their abilities to address these issues, especially at a time when all organs of government, both federal, state, and local, are all challenged as it relates to broadband deployment. We can move on to the next slide. I think Tom's telling me I should speed it up, but so another couple things in the buckets of general recommendations. Tax incentives are pretty key in really tipping the scale for a provider that's looking at making a go, no-go decision in a particular community, or looking to deploy additional funds to upgrade a network. That adoption gap between higher income and lower income communities really can impact a provider's incentives to go into that community, which is why tax incentives and things like regulatory barriers really do make an impact on, both generally in terms of deployment, but then it's particularly of need in communities where that adoption level and percentage may not be there as it is in communities that have higher income on average. So the tax incentives as well as the regulatory barriers, and we do call out some examples of good things that have been done in certain jurisdictions, and recommend those as paths forward for better community deployment. We can move on to the next slide. Here are three more that we'd like to highlight. Community Reinvestment Act, which is a great example of a way to encourage general deployment, facilitating middle mile and last mile broadband on an underserved communities generally, also positively impacts low income communities, as well as expanding and establishing state programs. I won't get into these in too much detail, but this goes into the partnership aspect of things. Is when we're talking about infrastructure generally, we should try to include broadband specifically in those programs as well. Things like dig once and other examples of ways that broadband infrastructure can be included in other infrastructure deployment opportunities will only have a positive impact on deployment in low-income communities. So we can move on to the next slide. 8 is a theme that has been touched on repeatedly thus far, and we commend it again in this report. The amazing work that has been done federal government wide, and particularly here at the FCC to really provide a rapid response for telehealth, for online learning, and telecommuting through work that's already been mentioned previously. We highlight that again, and potentially lift up some of those things as things that may we want to make longer term or potentially permanent. Those are things that have shown a positive impact in encouraging broadband service growth, either in the first instance or for competition, that the group believes that we should commend as either semi-permanent or permanent solutions here. We've also touched on data, how that can be a challenge generally, and has specific ramifications here as it relates to low-income communities. Better data means better ability to attack this problem, and I think we've seen some very positive movement from the federal side, both by the passage of the Broadband Data Act and the FCC's digital opportunity data collection efforts, and we recommend those as examples and as initiatives that should be carried forward to fulsome conclusion, to be able to really put a finer point on where the problems are and how we attack them. We also recommend identification and utilization of publicly available open data sets that will enable not only governments but third parties to really take a look at and slice and dice data in new and innovative ways to be able to identify where problems are and where we can really address those problems. So those are some of the general ones. More on the wireless side of things, we again commend some of the great action that has been taken by government partners nationwide to facilitate a more rapid deployment of infrastructure. Those have really come in handy during the course of the pandemic to facilitate a faster deployment. I know that our members at WISPA have been really going pedal to the metal over the course of these past 9 months to hook up new folks, and the ability to do so quickly has really made a difference in those communities where folks may have been lacking service before, and we're able to quickly get it as a result of motivated communities and motivated providers to address those gaps. Spectrum access is another thing, another tool in the toolkit for addressing deployment in low-income communities. You can see some of the recommendations there that I won't necessarily go into it too deeply, but suffice to say that smart spectrum policy can really be a driver for deployment and better service quality in low-income communities, and we put forward some recommendations there as well. So those, as Tom mentioned at the top, were the general recommendations. Now we go into a few that are more specific to low-income communities generally. The first is not necessarily a new idea. It is something that has been championed by Chairman Pai and Senator Capito in particular, creating opportunity zones, preferencing low-income communities that are currently lacking sufficient broadband availability, but really introducing some streamlined deployment-friendly policies. We reference more of that in the report and elsewhere, so would commend that as one of the solutions that would really drive deployment in low-income communities. We also commend efforts for both on the spectrum, on the subsidy, on the tax incentive, and other incentive sides that will really encourage further investments in low-income areas. And we highlight a couple of examples. For example, the tribal set aside in the the FCC's EBS work, which really will make spectrum access more available on tribal lands, as well as the C-band auction set-aside proposal that would take a portion of the funding that will come from that auction and turn around and use that for deployment in areas that do not have robust broadband available today. These are things that the group believes will have a particular impact on low-income communities. Again, we talked about tax policy generally. That does have an impact on deployments, but if you hone that policy in specifically on low income areas, you'll get better deployments in low income communities. That is an aspect of the gigabit opportunity zone, but we also identify this separately from that broader proposal as a way to encourage investment in low-income communities. And we talked a little bit about this earlier on in the partnership aspect, but sometimes really setting down and thinking and bringing all the stakeholders to the table to strategically plan about how to address some of the deployment challenges in low-income communities can provide a strong foundation for addressing the issues. We've seen some amazing work happen over the course of the pandemic that has really formed the basis for some of the case studies that we commend to you in the report today. And it's really difficult in a very action-oriented society and a time right now where we need results to sit back and do some of that strategic planning. But those are things that really can reap multifold benefits going forward as a result of that. And again, we highlight the Community Reinvestment Act again as a way to take a look at ways that infrastructure projects in low-income areas can be further incented beyond just the general recommendations. So we can move on to the next slide, and I believe that is it. I would recognize our subcommittee chair, Mr. Feiss, if he wants to make additional observations or comments at the end, anything that I may have given in incomplete or treatment, or whether there are additional things that he would like to highlight as we go into the comments and discussion period. Jeff, if you are there and have the ability to speak, would like to recognize you there for just a minute before we turn it back over to Tom. Oh, I can see you, but I can't hear you. Jeff, are you there? All right. Well, it seems like Jeff may be having some technical difficulties, so we'll turn it back over to Tom and give him an opportunity to speak at another point. But Tom, thank you for the opportunity to present that piece of the report.
Great. Thank you, Claude. Jeff, if you signal to us that you're back online, we'll let you. Well, he's got his earbuds there, so maybe momentarily here.
Does this help? Can you hear me now?
Beautiful. There we go.
Aha. So easier to dig my earbuds out of my backpack than to try to reconfigure my computer for computer microphone. So anyway, Claude, thanks, and Tom, thanks. It's been a pleasure to work with you and the members of the working group. I have nothing to add. I think, Claude, you did a great job of summarizing where we are, and it's just been a pleasure to be involved with this and look forward to the discussion.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. Madam Chair, Vice Chair Young, that concludes our walkthrough of the report. Certainly, we want to accommodate any questions or revision requests or discussions that the group may have. Before we get to that, I guess if there was a section in the slide deck where I think Claude and I would say, well, gosh, what would we? And I know we'll harvest many more lessons learned as we facilitate that deliberate session at closeout. But one of the things I think we all regret, we had a lot of energy right before COVID about building a traveling team to go visit one or two of these communities that have really implemented programs that worked well. So the field trip opportunity, I think, was a great idea. I don't know if other groups have done that in the past, but we were really looking forward to a road trip, Chairwoman, and unfortunately that was dashed with our global pandemic. But perhaps the next iteration can actually take our work from the offices in DC and take them to the field. So with that, I'll yield, Chairwoman, and take any questions.
Thank you. Well, at this point in time, we will open the floor for discussions and questions, comments regarding the Broadband Investment in Low-Income Communities Working Group report. And I see that the Vice Chair, David Young, has his hand up already.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Tom. I really appreciate your work. I wanted to call out to the group what I think are some things that did not make it into the presentation, but are very important. On page 19 of the proposal, the document, the working group really cited two areas we think are very important: the Arkansas Act to provide additional access to broadband service and the Mississippi Broadband Enabling Act. These are two acts at a state level that remove restrictions on building out for electrical co-ops and encourage public-private partnerships. The Mississippi Act was in a state that was ranked 49th in the country for broadband. And the amount of investment is in the hundreds of millions of dollars that has gone forward since that act was passed. In Arkansas, you've seen a flourish of public-private partnerships between cities and private providers to build out networks. I wanted to make sure to call that to the attention of the BDAC. Furthermore, the policy discussion regarding share it for frequencies in rural areas, I think, is very important. And that was a pretty vigorous discussion and made it into the recommendations as well. I really appreciate the work that went into this in the document. I just wanted to call that to the attention of the other BDAC members. Tom, Claude, thank you very much for the work.
Well, Vice Chair, thank you for bringing that to you're right, that should have been amplified. It was definitely a great part of the report, and I appreciate you underscoring that.
Yeah, and just to underscore the underscore and give credit to the BDAC as a whole, I want to say that a lot of that was made possible by the work of this organization. So we are making a real difference in the world. And I think that David touched on that, but I just wanted to amplify. And with that, I'll pass it to Nancy Werner.
Thank you, Chair Bowles. I have a couple of substantive comments, but first I just had a question, I guess maybe to Tom. You talked about it being a draft, and I'm just kind of wondering what the process is for finalizing it. I noticed reading through it, there are a number of places where there, says cite ? And just little things like that. And I just want to get a better understanding of what you are thinking would be the finalization process. Because if we're voting today, I guess I want to know what we're voting on, and if changes are going to be made in the future, who's making them? Do we get to look at it again? That kind of stuff. I can't tell how substantive some of these changes or finalizations might be. So before I go into anything substantive, I just was hoping you could touch on that a little bit more, because I'm not sure actually if we're intending to vote on this document today or not.
Chairwoman, do you want to preclude my comments there, or do you want me to?
No, you go right ahead. Sure. You go right ahead.
Yeah. So I will say with confidence that some of the, and certainly that's not to pressure you into a vote you don't want to make. The citations, some of these things are really, I don't know that they're going to alter the recommendation. So it's my belief that we have provided enough content that could facilitate a voting action. we were shooting or going up against some of the game clock here, and we were a little light on getting some of these things nailed down as far as citations. But I do believe, Nancy, that most of these are superficial and don't affect the outcome of the recommendation or the veracity of the recommendation. So I think you'll find that, with the exception perhaps of on page 20, we do have an NGA permission that we are still outstanding, unless, Jeff, you've received word from them since we submitted this in September. I believe other than that, and again, the other one being the inclusion of the Chicago case study, which is basically a streamlining of their own words. We didn't create new copy. I don't think you'll find anything that gets into something that would fundamentally change once they are included. So, as far as final production, I would look to the chair to pace our work here, but I don't think this is anything that would elude, something before certainly the December 1st timeframe at the latest. These are clerical issues.
So, yeah, so just right. So procedurally, it's really up to the BDAC what we want to do or not do. So if we feel comfortable that, adding a site here or there is not substantive enough to preclude a vote, then we can go ahead and vote. But if we feel that there are things that need to be adjusted, changed, modified that are substantive in nature and substantially, in the past we've made changes on the fly and approved the report as modified, which can happen. But sometimes the changes are so substantial that the committee's not comfortable with voting on it. So at that point, it goes back to the working group and they'll finalize, and it would be ready in December at that point. So that's your question. I think you had another comment though, yeah?
Yeah, I did. And I want to go back to I guess part of my first question is the working group comfortable with, I think they're probably just citations, not a big deal, but I don't know if members of the working group felt like if that sentence or comment or idea is supported by a citation, I support it. If it's not, I don't. I don't know if it comes down to that level. So that would just be my other question does the working group still support the document? I assume the working group supports the document, but is there the possibility that some of these changes might create an issue among the working group? So I can't answer that. Obviously, that was not in the working group. And then just one other question that came up based on the presentation. To Claude, the slides you went through, the recommendations were worded a little bit differently. Some of the examples were kind of moved a little bit from what's in the report. Is that going to change from the draft report, or did you just rearrange things a bit for your presentation?
No, that was just a consolidation
Okay.
and cosmetic issues. The document that the BDAC would be voting on today is the report and not the presentation.
Okay, thank you. Because I do have some concerns with those recommendations, specifically in 2.5.1. I feel like several of them are not very well explained in the report, and I don't know if that's just sorry.
I'm sorry, Nancy, if I could, Justin, is it possible to pull up the report so everybody knows what provision is being referenced? I think that might be helpful. I can do it, but I don't know if you can share.
Yeah, if
I can do it,
only
Elizabeth.
because I'm on an iPad because of
That's page 8.
these technology is a little bit weird, so I don't have a direct
David's got it.
connection this way.
I've got it. I'll share it.
And I'm talking about page 18.
Give me 30 seconds here. I need to share my screen, and I wonder who else is sharing their
While you're
screen.
sharing, Tom, do you want to address the question of the working group's comfort level? I mean, I was on that working group, and I felt that the working group was comfortable with the vote today, if that's what the BDAC wants to do. But but you're the chair, so why don't you address that real quick?
Thank you, Chairman. I would say without hesitation that Nancy, yes, our subcommittee. In fact, I think we met in 3 consecutive days prior to the final certification of this draft. And I get the irony of a certified draft, but it is, we believe that it was defensible and we would stand behind that. And almost, it was unanimous. We had no dissension. I don't even think we had an abstention on any of the items that we were putting forward. Jeff, you may keep me honest on that. It has been 30 days since I guess we convened that group, that last touch, but I believe we had unanimous agreement to take forward our recommendations.
I agree, Tom. I think that's right.
Yes.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
So I don't want to go on forever, but just if you just look at the first bullet point, to me, I get sort of where you're going with it, especially from the presentation, but I think that someone who picked up this report, it's not clear what exactly the streamlined deployment-friendly policies are that you're referencing. I don't feel like there was a lot of discussion, really any discussion in the body of the document before we get to this recommendation, other than the general, if deployment is less expensive, then that maybe opens up a business case in an area that otherwise doesn't have a great business case for deployment. But I guess I don't know what this recommendation means, like as a practical matter, and who it's addressed to. Similarly, the reference to the small cell order and other clarifications, that stuff is done at the national level. I'm not sure what the recommendation is. I'm assuming it's not, it's a done deal. So I guess I'm just having some trouble with some of these recommendations that don't, again, they're not really clearly addressed in the body of the report, and there's not a lot of substantive explanation in these bullet points of what they mean.
I've got that, Nancy. And so to feed back to you, specificity in some of these more generic areas leaves less to the imagination. So, Jeff, do you care to respond to that? I don't know if we might be clearly, Nancy, if that is a recommendation here, we will take that back and add meat to that, either through examples or explicit reference points.
Yeah, I think those are fair criticisms. On the first one, establish broadband-friendly policies. I think it's more a sort of a philosophical approach that when we are discussing public policy or broadband matters, we ought to be able to consider, or just when we're talking about infrastructure, it's more a philosophical overlay. That's why it's number one. It's kind of a general deployment incentive that when we're talking about broadband deployment, we should be cognizant of facilitating investment decisions and low-income communities. So, and I understand that's a fair criticism. So, we're more than happy to take that back and either add more to it or delete it. As far as the small cells issue is, yes, that is a done deal, but it is an example of removing regulatory barriers. At the state level, I think there still are regulatory barriers to remove, and any sort of property issues that get in the way of deploying facilities still need to be, we still need to look at removing regulatory barriers, such as what the small cells order did at the federal level.
Yeah, I understand that. I guess I go back to the point of what other barriers are we talking about? I represent local government members, and I can't support recommendations that may be going toward preempting local government, maybe not. I'm not really sure what the issue is. And going back to the first bullet point, I don't have a problem with suggesting deployment-friendly policies. I think the word streamlined is not my favorite word. And the examples in the presentation that Claude gave weren't really streamlined. They were, you could call them deployment-friendly. I don't know that I would call them streamlined. That term, for some of us who work in local government, has been meant preempt local government. So that word itself is concerning. So I guess that's what I'm getting at is I understand that these are some examples of what's happened in the past, but I can't support recommendations that I can't explain to my members. And similarly, like the reference to the model state and municipal code, I like that you called out railroads. I know there's rural broadband provisions in there that are not called out, which I think would be the municipal model code. Was written in a way that would be like, understood that every local government's different and what policies they may adopt are up to their own needs. So I'm not sure what parts of that code are being recommended. So again, sorry, I'm going on and on. I think I've made my point. I feel like these need to be removed or significantly clarified before we vote on it. And I'll stop talking and let somebody else talk.
I actually have some thoughts to that, but Eve is in line. She's next. So Eve Lewis.
Hi, thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you all for your time. And I love these meetings because I learned so much from the, amazing resources that you all are as individuals. And I humbly walk into this realm, with my hat as a local government attorney. And I'm just so grateful for what I learned. And that folds into this. I mean, this report is really well supported. I appreciate all the citations that, I do echo what Nancy was mentioning. Some of the sites aren't there, which are a little concerning, but I mean, many of them are. And I appreciate all the work that did go into this. And I learned a lot having read it. I especially liked, and so really where I wanted to go with this first is, I first pass off a question to you all to educate me in learning this process from your industry standpoint. The Navajo Nation example was really an interesting example. And I recognize that the caveat was made that, bankrolling that forever indefinitely is not an option. But I suppose just to let me know, how it was even made possible to begin with, how is that organization able to, support that on the supply side and the costs that they've incurred? So just as an example, how are they able to bankroll that?
Eve, this is Tom. I don't know that I'm equipped to give you, satisfactory response to that. Perhaps Kimball, who helped us with that case study, if she's on the line, perhaps she can feedback, or we can certainly take that back and provide you some additional clarity on that question.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I think that's a very interesting scenario. I think they've done a wonderful thing out there, and I'd like to know more about how they were able to offset their costs, just as, a case study. And then, so I have a couple other things, and this was, once again, a fascinating report. On page 31, under the paragraph of availability of a broadband connection. So I recognize that under footnote 81, the reference is Internet Access Services report that the FCC authored, and it said 81% of developed census blocks, those that contain housing units, households have access to 3 or more broadband providers, and an additional 18% have access to 2 providers. But then, so that would be 99% access. And then in the following paragraph, it identifies that more than 22% of Americans in rural areas and over 27% of Americans on tribal lands lack the fixed terrestrial broadband. So I'm not really clear on the deficiency and how those 2 paragraphs interact. So I just wanted to get some clarity there.
Okay. Eve, thank you for that question. Anthony, are you with us today? I know you helped synthesize some of this. Perhaps you want to take a first spot.
I am here. Just give me a second to reread the provision. Yeah, I would have to go back and look at the underlying data. I apologize.
I also actually think there's a typo in that paragraph that's starting with however. In the quote, it said broadband services not being available or available at, oh, I had or available, never mind, I misread it. Sorry, I take it back.
Great. Great. Well, thank you.
Eve, let me make sure I've got that. So two questions.
I think that, I think the percentages, I think we definitely need to dig into it, but I think, Eve, that part of the reason it's hard to figure out the math is that it has to do with population centers versus non-population centers. So you can have 22% of rural Americans without broadband, but that may only comprise a very small percentage of the total population in the United States. So I think that that's what's happening. I think that's the interaction why they don't quite line up mathematically, is because you have 11 million people or 9 million people who live in Manhattan, but the state of New York has a lot of rural areas that may not have access to broadband, but it's just fewer people.
And, and this is Claude. I would also add that I think the difference between the first and second paragraph I believe is due to the fact that in analyzing competition, the FCC does include satellite broadband, but you'll see in the second paragraph we're talking about fixed terrestrial connections, and I believe in the footnote it does note that satellite broadband covers the large majority of the United States.
And so thank you for your guys' collective expertise and insight. So from someone who admittedly only practices in this space in a very small slice of my practice, I would just want that to kind of be crystallized so that a reader could really walk away from there saying, okay, I get the numbers, I get the different digital platforms, the fixed terrestrial versus the satellite. And then perhaps, I don't know if that folds back into possibly, the dilemma. I mean, once again, so satellite, if it is being offered to 99% of individuals nationwide, I mean, obviously we need that last 1%, but to reframe the issue in that context might be helpful, for persons like me who are just looking at this, sort of outside in.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point, Eve, because even in the first iteration of the BDAC, we had the satellite question. And I think that part of what's not being addressed in this provision is what you can do with it and what you can't do with certain types of technologies. So saying 99% of the country is covered by satellite may or may not be significant to what our work if even 20% of those people still can't do some basic functions that we accept from fixed terrestrial services. So I think it's a really excellent point that I'm glad you brought up.
Thank you. And thank you. Hopefully I'm not totally off base. So, and then so I do have just a few other questions, and really quickly I'll get to them. I don't want to monopolize the time. But so just circling back to the recommendations. So I know that, Tom, and thank you for your presentation, and all of the presenters have done excellent. I know you had mentioned, so there were 13 macro type recommendations and 5 micro type recommendations in the context uniquely for low income. But then on the slides, there were 10, and I know we're not going by the slides necessarily, we're going by the report. But when I went back to the report and I'm trying to, follow along, there were, I believe, 13 different arrows that highlighted the recommendations. And so I don't know if they were melded together in the report for the macro and micro, or they were bifurcated necessarily. It doesn't really have a classification for them.
I can help you with that. And actually, we'll, as we begin to bring final form to this report, we'll put numeric delineation instead of the arrows there. But if you'll, whoever's got the source doc, if you'll go to 18 there, establishing state and local streamline. And again, let me say this, Eve, the authoritative source for any deliberation or voting is the document, not the slides. So we did take some license with the slides for purposes of just flow. What you're looking at is the document for any type of record here. So you have 13. If you start with the establish and go with the outward arrows there, you will see 13 of those. And then as you get to page where the micro pickup will be in page 21. So 13 of those arrows would be collected prior to page 21. And then right here under the head, right after workforce, you'll see 2.5 point 2 is the specific, and the 5 that follow there are the specific micro areas of recommendation specific to low income. And again, it bears repeating. The reason we went with community and then specifically for low income, I mean, if I were you, I would be asking, well, you're charged with low income strategies. Why did you make the difference? It's because even the more general best practices of community incentivization can have impact, profound impact on low income. But there are some that are specific to triggering low income. And so that's why we made that distinction.
And that is helpful. Thank you. I wasn't actually looping through the next title. So thank you. But so then circling back to the first 13 bullet points, the arrow points. I do want to echo what Nancy mentioned in relation to what exactly the recommendation is in the general statement. I think there's there's a broad brush stroke here when it comes to, streamlining and, deployment friendly policies. So I too, representing a city in South Florida, I do have some concerns with, if the idea of streamline that you're indicating is, wholesale preemption, then clearly in my personal experience, and I feel like I've dealt with, from the city side, a lot of telecoms, and I've dealt with a lot of permitting, and we have 5 macro towers here in the city owned and operated. So I do feel as though when we start off by streamlining and preemption, we're already at sort of opposite sides of the spectrum, and it's already a pseudo adversarial scenario when it doesn't necessarily need to be. And I really loved the highlight of the public-private partnership. I think the whole crux of this is working together. Obviously, this is a technological advancement, it's development, and there has to be a balance between, what we have currently, we're proud of, we're not stagnant. We want to move forward. We want to be good partners. So the reality is, to preempt us, it starts off with confusion. It starts off with, so I don't think that's what you mean when you say streamline, but once again, the broad brush I don't think is helpful here. And I do think the public-private partnership emphasis is probably even seen in the marketplace is going to promote a public-private partnership, because obviously we have residents that have children, school-age children, and they need, we've been in situations where we recognize that great need and we want to serve all of our residents. So I just would want to recommend, if I could, taking out some of those broader brush strokes, the streamlining qualities. I just don't want that taken in the wrong context, or at least elaborated further. If you feel that these other actions of the FCC or the other actions of the BDAC in the past have been really fruitful, can you provide data to support the conclusions that you're making, that those actions are positive in the direct ways that you're intending? Because they're, some of them are older, 2 years old, so they should have some qualitative data to show, not just, a conclusory statement of sorts. So sure. With that, thank you so much. It was such a great report, and I really appreciate all of your insight always. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eve. I'm sorry, Tom, I actually would like to say something, and then I'll let you speak, and then I need to let Larry speak. I have to just expressing personally, I really appreciate the comments. I am actually surprised at the reaction to the word streamline, because I understand that that's apparently a trigger word for the municipalities. I get that, but what word would you suggest that we use? Because what we're really talking about is not preemption. What we're talking about, and I'll just use an anecdote because I'm big on the anecdote, Arkansas. I took the BDAC recommendations. I went to the governor of Arkansas. I had a meeting with him and the Department of Economic Development, and I said, this is what the state needs to do. And I gave them the report. And they turned around and did basically what the BDAC told them to do. They got rid of the ban on municipal ownership of broadband infrastructure. That's the first thing the state did. The second thing the state did was they took their CARES Act money and put it into a private-public partnership broadband fund. And my company is currently working with 9 different counties on getting broadband deployed by the end of the year because of the actions basically goes right to the BDAC. So we have that qualitative data, we can definitely put it in. But streamlining for me is the fact that I could go to the city of Hazen with a fiber drawing, and I knew within a week that I could deploy fiber. And I'm not going to hit the end of the year if Hazen sits on that for 3 months, but they didn't. I knew within actually 2 days. I gave them the drawing. They said, this is approved. That's what I mean by streamline. It's not preempting what the city does or what the communities do. It's about creating a working partnership where things move faster so that there's always a pain point. So my pain point is now none of the municipalities I work with, my pain point is getting the manufacturers to ship me gear. So that's now I've got a different, and that's where the pain point, it ought to be there. It shouldn't be in the partnership between the providers and the communities, because we're both on the same side. As you said, getting broadband to everyone is basically everyone's end goal here. So I guess I would like to know what you need to see in that, because my understanding, my personal understanding of that provision is in that context, not in the context of now let's take away local control because the municipality shouldn't be determining what they do with their rights away. That is absolutely not the case. And at least not from me. So yeah, so you think about what language would make sense, because streamlining for me is a very different thing than what you guys are hearing. And Tom, I don't know if you want to say something before Larry, but Larry also we have a few people with their hands up.
Yeah, please, Larry.
Larry.
Okay, I'll go ahead. I thought Tom was going to respond. Well, first, let me say that I really appreciate the work of the committee, and Tom, Scott, Claude, all of you have done some tremendous work, and this is a very good document. And I have a couple of recommendations, suggestions, and also support some of the things that both Nancy and Eve have said. Something rather small, starting on page 3 in the preamble, it says there's evidence that broadband infrastructure and adoption may lag behind connectivity in higher income areas. And to me, if you use the word evidence, I mean, that's specific. I think the word may should be removed. And I think it should be that broadband infrastructure and adoption lags. So remove the word may and pluralize lags, or change the evidence to their speculation, because if there's evidence, there's evidence. And to me, I think it is pretty clear that adoption does lag in low-income areas. So I'd make that recommendation. And then on page 18, where Nancy and others spoke, section 2.5.1, I have concerns about using very limited specific examples. So for instance, it singles out property tax abatement as a tax incentive idea. And obviously, we've talked a lot about COVID and how it's impacted our country, and that includes our local governments. And, for local governments, most have really seen their sales tax suffer, their hotel motel taxes, their business licenses fees. The one stable piece of a local government's income portfolio is property taxes. And now to suggest is sort of singling it out that it's something they can waive or abate. I don't think we're in an economic environment where that's viable. And let me tell you, just like deaths are a lagging indicator in COVID, you start with cases and then hospitalizations and then deaths. Property taxes are a lagging indicator in local government revenue. So a year from now, when foreclosures have happened and distress sales have happened and short sales have happened, and state laws require all of those to be factored into property values, you're going to see property taxes decline in cities and counties all across this country. So I found that suggestions become examples or expectations, and I would like to see that specific example removed, property tax abatement. It's there and it's listed again, I believe, on page 22. Otherwise, I think we need to include other examples of incentives, such as San Jose example of large private carriers contributing millions of dollars to cities to use it to deploy to let lower income, less served, underserved areas of the community. We need to be a little more inclusive in our examples if we're going to give examples where both the public sector gives as well as the private sector gives. But my preference is that property tax abatement be removed as an example.
Larry, where's the second citation? I don't want to miss that.
The second citation was on page 22. Property tax abatement is again mentioned.
Okay, I just want to highlight that for comment.
And then also in that section in 2.5.1, there are things that I feel are overly vague. So one state example is not a trend. You could make an argument it's an outlier. but I don't understand what it means when it says lawmakers in New York are opposing. That doesn't say something is passed. And when you say lawmakers, does that mean some? Does that mean all? Does that mean a piece of legislation is passed? So unless there's a specific piece of legislation we're referencing, it concerns me when we have language that says that lawmakers are opposing. I don't know what that means. And
I don't see that language right yet. I'd just like to read it.
okay, I didn't write that page number, but I'll come back and find
No,
it.
no, that's fine because I agree with you. That is vague. That should not be that. It should be the state legislator, or it should be either more specific or.
And in that same section, it made a reference to House and Senate proposals. I don't think we really should be referencing House and Senate proposals unless we're going to reference all House and Senate proposals, because we shouldn't suggest to a certain point of view House and Senate proposals. I don't think that it adds value. It's too open-ended. So I would suggest we either explain and confirm and give the specific legislation to the New York example in the House and Senate proposals, or not use that as an example, because proposals are something that are not law and have not passed. And then the data.
I think this is a reference to Larry, I think this is a reference to the previous, and I could be wrong. I'll let the drafter address this, but I think this refers to the previous. There's a reference earlier in the document to specific proposals that are broadband geared, and they're actually on both sides of it. Like there's the proposal that came out of the House. There's a couple of proposals that came out of the Senate, and it's essentially most of the recent broadband. I think it might be a reference to those same things, and the site missing is probably part of what's causing confusion here.
Okay. And that's helpful, but that also illustrates my point. You think that it might be, but I would like to know that that's what it is. So, regarding data resources, I think I like this, and I think it's critically important. I'll tell you why in a second, but I think we should push for that to be stronger. My example here in Georgia, our governor created an advisory committee for broadband deployment and had the industry, and I served on it, and we did great work, and we were maybe the first state in the country to actually map the entire state. I can tell you what a struggle it was. In fact, it took 8 months to a year to get some providers to be willing to share their information. It was exhausting, and it held up the mapping for a year. So I think we should strengthen that. Not as sort of an aspirational, and it again comes up on page 39 under improved data sharing. It says data is not often coordinated or shared, and data sharing and coordination are necessary steps for both public and private stakeholders, and something the federal government would be best to lead. To me, that's sort of soft and aspirational. I would like to see it specific and mandatory with a suggestion of how it would be done. And so that would be also on page 27, my final one. It talks about the cost of services and equipment as a barrier. And I'm curious, where are the suggestions to lower the cost of service and equipment to reduce this barrier? So if we're going to talk about this as a barrier to deployment in low-income areas, I would like to see what the suggestions are to eliminate or remove or minimize that barrier of the cost of service and the cost of equipment.
Okay.
Brian here.
Thank you, and thank you all for this report. A lot of good information here. And I really want to say thanks to Claude and Tom for leading up this effort. A couple things. First, I really do appreciate some great examples in here, and I think the Madam Chairwoman referenced one I thought that was really good, the Mississippi, with them changing their lot of electric co-ops to get into broadband. One other kind of aspect of this I want to bring up that hasn't been fully addressed in a lot of areas is, first, there are some states that still, if an electric co-op can't get into broadband, limit the area that they can deploy to, usually limits to their electric co-op service territory. So that is still a limitation for many of my members that are trying to get into this. Also, I'd love to bring up something that's a little bit broader that can really help the industry as a whole. That's the addressing of electric easements. this isn't just for my members that are doing broadband, but if they want to lease out that capacity, or even some of the large investor-owned utilities, if they're deploying fiber to help their operational electric grid, and they have excess capacity. Right now, if their state has really restrictive easement laws, they cannot lease that out to broadband providers because they would be in violation of that. So that's something I bring up. Then specifically in that 2.5.1 section, there was a reference to the BDAC report, and there was I think a reference specifically to the provision on railroad passings. And trust me, I know that's a big issue. My members deal with it on the broadband and electric side. But it seems to me that there were some provisions in that report that were more relevant in my mind, and that is Articles 9 and 10 of the State Model Code, 9 being the Rural Broadband Deployment Assistance Fund, and Article 10 being the Rural Municipal-Owned Broadband Networks, which I think specifically would be more in line with what we're trying to get at here, which is to reduce the costs for these low-income communities. So if you're going to reference one, I think these ones that are, in my mind, would be much more relevant and have a bigger impact for low-income communities and bringing down the deployment costs would make a lot of sense to reference.
Thank you, Brian. And I will note that those are specifically the two provisions that Arkansas passed when they did their broadband stuff. So I think you have a good point there. Doug Dimitrov.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Can you
Yes.
hear me? Okay,
we got
thank you. Sorry, I'm having some technical issues on my end. Just a couple of quick notes on the streamline point, which I understand that Nancy and Eve made. I just want to point out, again, I fully agree, Chairwoman Bowles, that streamline is not intended to mean, and never has been intended to mean, preemption. And we took great pains in the early stages in the Model Code for Municipalities work to simply identify, a code which could be adopted, which had, a relatively comprehensive code. But we never recommended, and there was a lot of good discussion around this, and certainly Vice Chair, our Vice Chair knows that as well. David, you were instrumental in helping to pull that together, the Model Code for Municipalities together. But one of the things I point out is the BDAC itself, the mission is to, I don't think the mission uses the word streamline, but it does say accelerate, which I think is the same concept. And I do think, although I haven't been able to check this on the call yet today, but I think the Model Code for Municipalities and perhaps the State Model Code group as well, the FCC looked for streamlining, that word was used. So again, I just want to highlight, I don't think has ever been any intent, and I like the concept of leaving the term streamline or maybe accelerate, if that makes people more comfortable, in the report, because it ties back to all of the work that so many of on this committee rather, and the working group in particular, did a couple of years ago. I do also recognize, as I said at the beginning of this comment, that fully the question and the issue. So I think maybe the reference to or the explanation that what was intended in the Model Code for Municipalities was not a preemption, but a set of a code which provided lots of things for a community to consider might be some way to approach it. So some reference to collaboration or consideration be given, but I don't think we should remove the concept or reference to the Model Code for Municipalities.
Thank you. Ken Simon. Oh no, Jonathan Adelstein, sorry. Jonathan, you're first.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me okay? Well, yes. First I want to put this in a broader context. I mean, this is such an important issue, and we are poised to make huge progress. Thank Claude for the great work on this report. I think that we've seen such activity on this just this week from the FCC on the 5G fund. You're looking at a lot of work being done in Congress. $100 billion package has been passed by the House, mostly for rural, but there's substantial funding in there for adoption and low income. We've never seen this kind of attention on this issue before. So this is a very important report. It's getting the attention it deserves. And the issue finally, I think, is getting the attention. We are poised for unprecedented investments by the federal government in addressing the issue of broadband adoption, of addressing the issue of low income, and addressing the issue of rural and the digital divide that I've ever seen. And I was involved in the government in attempting to address the digital divide under the Obama administration, where we tried to deal with the rural issue through the Rural Utility Service and my friend Larry Strickling on the NTIA side. And we made some progress, but there's clearly a long way to go, as this report indicates. So thanks for the work on that. I did want to raise one issue, since there's been a litany of kind of little issues raised. It sounds like we may be going back and trying to fix things, but on in the report in section 2.3, there's kind of a reference to some theoretical ideas about, whether there's systemic discrimination. These are pretty serious things to be throwing around as a theory. I mentioned in my report that we really focused on trying to get a consensus, and we achieved a consensus in the disaster relief and recovery package. And this certainly is not a consensus item to put in this report. So if we're going to go back to the drawing board on this a little bit on some of these issues, I certainly think at the bottom of page 12 and page 13, I'd like to have that paragraph fixed. Thanks for pulling that up, where it says "in this regard," the paragraph that begins "in this regard." I think that paragraph really has got to go, because there just isn't evidence for this. I mean, it says here that it's a theory, and we're talking about an evidence-based approach here. The data is not clear. I mean, clearly, there's been massive investments by my industry in low-income communities, massive, and they've transformed the lives there of so many citizens. And to throw around things like this, to me, it's just not necessary. And the data is not clear, as even noted in the report. So if we're trying to put it together, an expert report, why are we putting in things that are unclear? But if my sense is procedurally we're going back and fixing these things, I just like the opportunity to try to clean this up a bit if we're not going to be voting on it today. Is that right? We're not voting today on this report?
Chairwoman, I believe with the degree of edits requests, I think this has been a great feedback loop for us. And I believe with the chair's permission, we bring something back in December for your consideration. I think we're taking it off the table for voting.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll work with you on this 2.3. I think there's some fairly easy fixes we can make to address that.
Yeah. And Jonathan, just as you're doing that, I think that I hear you and I agree with you that we need to be extremely careful. But I also think that we have to acknowledge that not all players play equally, and that there are some cases of redlining that do exist, and we can't pretend it doesn't ever happen. But I agree that it does need to be evidence-based. So if you can, walk that line. I think your input will be very valuable here.
I'm not sure it's ever been proven, just for the record here. I mean, there is a discussion about ROI, and people do go where that is, but some of these low-income communities have incredible demand and are being really well served. I mean, they're very dense in many cases and covered in broadband and going to get early 5G. I mean, I've just never seen proof. I mean, here we're talking about some theories, and it's a pretty serious thing to throw around. So I just think that we can clear that.
Okay. Yeah, and I hear you on that completely. I was just wanting to be sure that we are taking an honest look at it. And it may not be intentional is the other thing too. It may be what you're talking about, ROI or lack of density of population, and we don't want to address the wrong problem.
Right.
Okay. Are you done? I'm sorry, are you done? Do you have something else?
Yes, that's it. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you. Ken Simon.
Thank you. First, let me pass along my congratulations to this group. Tom and Claude have done a great job leading this working group, and tremendous work done by the chairs and vice chairs of the subgroups as well. Lots of good information in here. I think we may have addressed many of the things that I wanted to visit about, but I did want to circle back to two things. First, the comments with regard to 2.5.1 and streamlining deployment. I just wanted to voice my agreement with the comments that you, Madam Chairwoman, have made with regard to how we should take the word streamlining. I would also agree with the comments made by Doug Dimitrov on that. Clearly, the mission is to accelerate deployment, to encourage deployment. Those are all things that I think are encompassed by the use of the word streamlined, and certainly I don't think any of us intended to be equated with preemption, but rather it really is trying to find ways to accelerate and encourage deployment as much as possible. And just wanted to voice my support for that, as well as for the references to affirming the prior work done by the BDAC with respect to the various working groups and the resulting reports that were in fact approved by the BDAC to that end. Secondly, I think it was ultimately worked out as between you, Madam Chairwoman, and Jonathan, but I agree with the comments with regard to some of the language there on pages 13 and 14, not necessarily being needed in order to support the conclusions in the report. I think there's some very good language there without necessarily having to go into some of the things that border more on theories or assumptions that can be utilized to support the recommendations in the report. And so I would encourage us to go back and look carefully at that language. So those are the two comments I have, but overall a great report, and really appreciate all the hard work done by all the members of the working group.
Thank you, Ken. Kelly Cole.
Hi, let me get on screen. The one comment that I had was actually, I'm just going to open up a whole different section of the document just for everybody's enjoyment. But on page 21, under the wireless infrastructure deployment incentives, under the second bullet point, the way that I read that is sort of that it's giving a preference to industry spectrum holders. And since there's a lot of different bands of spectrum. Some of them tribal are being used for tribal. Some of them are being used for education entities. It might make more sense. Like what I would recommend is maybe just changing the wording to say accommodating longer term consumer spectrum demands. Like I just feel like it's just I feel like making it a little bit more general would be more accurate and would reflect all the different stakeholders that are asking for STAs in different bands, and even there's we're using CBRS spectrum right now, and so just having it a very specific industry in that bullet point I don't think is as all-encompassing as it could be.
So would that be solved by just removing the word industry, or do you think we need to call out additional?
It would actually. I think it would. Yeah, I think it's just a one-word change, because I just think it's, I don't think the intent of the group was to just say only industry should ever have spectrum. And I think that we can all work out, through our comments in the FCC who should have what. But I think in this bullet point, I think it would make sense to make it more general, because I don't think everybody's in agreement on it being an industry-specific thing.
Yeah, I think we can support that. Yeah,
okay.
That's
Thanks.
Good.
But and I will say I really appreciated just the use it or lose it, just in general. I think, and I think that's happened from all sorts of different, not just industry stakeholders, but I think that definitely support that that the commission look at making sure that spectrum is being used so that consumers can have access to broadband. But great job, guys. It's I know that we have a lot of comments, and I think it's because this is an area that's close to everybody's hearts, but you guys have done a really good job.
Thank you. Is there, if there are no other comments, it's 1:50, and we're going to have Chairman Carr at 2. I imagine people are hungry, but like I said, we have Commissioner Carr at 2, Chairman Carr. Commissioner Carr at 2. So I'm going to make one last call for comments on this document. I will also invite those of you who have thoughts or comments that you didn't get to express to email the chairs of that committee, and the committee will take this back. We'll be looking to have a final report in December, which means that you should be, I don't know when the December meeting will be, but sometime mid-November, you should look to a revised version of this because you'll get it 30 days before the meeting. I'd like to take a 5-minute break if we could, and then come back for Commissioner Carr. And then the other thing is that if possible, I would like to move on and have the last working group report this afternoon. Before we take a break, I want to do one quick thing. Dilip Srihari has changed companies and he needs to make a disclosure.
Hi, Chairman Bowles, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Just wanted to let folks know that since the last full BDAC meeting, my employment situation has changed, and I'm now representing myself as an individual on the BDAC. And I just want to thank Justin and the FCC staff for getting the ethics paperwork cleared for that and finished up this morning. Thanks all.
Thank you very much. And it looks like Nancy has a comment, but do you?
Chair Bowles, I think you addressed it. I was going to ask how we could communicate our comments to the group, and you mentioned it. And I just want to very quickly say thank you for the clarifications on the word streamlining. I apologize for my paranoia on that term. It shows up a lot, like in the FCC small cell order. So, I tend to be concerned about how it may be taken. So I appreciate everyone's comments on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, let's take a 5-minute break. Please try to be back within 5 minutes, as we do have the commissioner coming in at 2, and then we can decide if we're moving on. Personally, I'd like to soldier through, but I understand if people need a break for lunch. So ponder whether we can, go ahead and continue. I will say that David Young will not be able to join us tomorrow, so that was another reason it'd be great if we could hear the report today. So 5 minutes, everybody. See you soon. So welcome back, everybody. Thanks for returning from break promptly. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr.
Well, thank you all so much for the chance to offer a couple of words, really of my gratitude and thanks. I know I probably say this a lot when I visit with you all, but you each have very important, very time-consuming day jobs. I think particularly during these unusual times that we're in, the divide between personal life, professional life feels like it's completely missing in our lives. And I know for me, it feels like work never starts and work never stops. And when on top of all that, you're taking on the additional burden of volunteering your time, essentially for the BDAC here, it goes without saying that we're very appreciative of it. And the issues and reports that you all are looking at right now are ones that are near and dear to my heart, particularly, of course, the workforce development issue. And I think, as I moved into this job, whenever we talk about, high-speed connectivity, I think we're very quick to sort of think about all of the jobs and opportunity that rides on these platforms, right? We can think about these, Silicon Valley kids, when you get my age, they're kids working in coffee shops with their Beat headphones, programming, and that's great. We love all that opportunity, but to get there, we got to build out these networks, and that takes a skilled workforce. And to be honest, we have a major gap right now. I think as your draft report walks through, we could hire something like 20,000 tower climbers alone right now. If you were to spread that out to fiber splicers and all the other work that we need, it's probably something closer to 100,000. So I think you all have identified really some practical solutions that can be implemented in the short run to close that gap. And that is how we're going to maintain sort of America's leadership. And it's a tough issue. I've tried to work on it from a community college perspective. That's been helpful. But I think the work that you are doing going just beyond that, including, apprenticeship models and whatnot, that's going to be how we close this gap. Is we've got to create as many different pipelines into this as possible. Some person can do multiple months or more in school or training. Others need a shorter path into it. So I think you guys are really on the right path here and very, very appreciative of it. Now, happy to take any quick questions you might have or allow you all to continue the good work, whatever you guys prefer.
Does anyone have any questions for Commissioner Carr? Well,
I might have a quick question here, if I could. You know, Congress, Commissioner, as you know, is talking about making major investments in broadband deployment. There's been action in both chambers. Assuming that at some point we get an infrastructure bill done, right now, as you've seen from this report, we have a shortage of workers that are skilled to build 5G as it is. What's going to happen if Congress invests a lot more money into a situation where there's already a lack of supply to meet the demand? And do you think maybe they need to make sure they provide some assistance for job training, reskilling people, making sure we address the 5G challenge so we can win the race to 5G and beat other countries that maybe are investing in their workforce in this area?
It's a great question. I do think, almost regardless of where we are from a workforce perspective, additional federal support will be put to use in turning dirt, building out, but to truly absorb a really significant sum of infrastructure dollars and to put those dollars to actual use, we gotta have a accordion out. You're a music guy. We got to accordion out, if I have my instrument right, our workforce a little bit here. So I think you're onto something when you say, to the extent that there is a very significant sum of money, some of that should be directed to short-term training programs so that we'll have the people to put those dollars to use. So I think that's a great idea, that as we talk infrastructure, workforce should be part of those discussions.
Thank you.
Yeah, I actually couldn't agree more. And this is really a brilliant segue because we're about to hear from our workforce group. So that's really great tee up. And I want to thank you very much for coming and for your kind words. We've really enjoyed this work and we're looking forward to hearing the next report. So anything else you'd like to add for? All right.
No, just thank you. I appreciate it. Great to see you again.
Thank you so much.
Hey, Brandon, before you go, one last thing.
Yeah.
Got accordion out.
There you go. Perfect.
All right, for the record.
Good addition. For the record, moment of levity.
Love it. Love it.
Leticia and Rickon, you are to move forward.
Yeah, we.
All right. Well, in that case, I would like to introduce Leticia Latino and Rickon Thacker, the chair and vice chair, respectively, of the Broadband Infrastructure Deployment Job Skills and Training Opportunities Working Group. It's currently 2:00. We have scheduled for this presentation until, let's see, I'm going to try to translate this time. You have about an hour, and then we will have about 45 minutes for discussion and, if appropriate, a vote. So with that, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Just want to make sure you can hear me. Everybody can hear? Good. Can you hear? Yes. Okay, good. Thank you very much. I don't know if we get, do I get to share the presentation somehow that I miss here?
Yes, there should be a little box, a little square with an arrow. If you click on that, it should let you share your presentation.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so that should be going right now. Okay, so thank you. Is it going? I'm sorry, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not seeing it.
Share. Let's see now, it should come.
There you go.
Okay, good.
So now you're sharing your desktop. Now you just need to pull the presentation up.
Okay, good.
There you go.
All right, thank you so much. So let me do this again. Thank you so much again, Madam Chair. It's truly a pleasure to be here today representing the Job Skills Working Group report. This was since the beginning, 15 months ago that we started, with a brand new group. Was exciting just to be tasked with this with this mission of coming up with recommendations to something that, as Commissioner Carr said, it's, I think, close to a lot of people's hearts, because creating jobs, I think it's something that resonates with people. So before I go on, I really want to acknowledge each and every one of this group, working group, because they work incredibly hard. They come with creative ideas, very proactive approach to trying to solve the situation. And so with that, a lot of them, we have probably, I think, 6 people move out of the working group because they either change jobs or other reasons, and they are all acknowledged in our report. And so I want to make sure that we recognize their incredible contribution. And what we want to cover today, it's just our thoughts, both Ricky as a vice chair and myself, remarks as to how we see the recommendations that we put forward, what the working group works specifically, and we'll go through the final recommendations and open the floor for comments and discussion. So although we were caught a little bit off guard by presenting today rather than tomorrow, as I had a moment to pick on something that Chairman Pai said this morning about how we as America have right now broadband front and center, in the front page. He said, we are in the front page. And so I put this something together like saying, yeah, everywhere you look, we're talking about, the digital divide. We're talking about workers are needed and the disaster response in a way that we never imagined before, having to address a pandemic. I'm pretty sure that some of you already experienced a telehealth visit. We have the kids online schooling, and we've been working remotely. So it really has touched every single aspect of our lives. And with that, I think we have to keep, let's say, on our toes, that we have a unique opportunity, and we've said this before, of really having this conversation at a national level. And in that sense, Commissioner Carr has been an incredible advocate for workforce, as he said in his opening remarks. And everywhere you look, he's promoting, our workforce and sending the message out. So I think there's urgency in these recommendations. We have a unique opportunity, but to me, it's like surfing. When there are waves, you can surf, but when the waves go away, even if you have the table, you won't be able to surf. So I think that we definitely have a unique opportunity to make a difference, and that makes it very, very exciting for me leading this working group, but also that the recommendations that the group came up with, I think they're very tangible recommendation, actionable, and that if implemented short term, we could see an immediate result coming out of them. So I think that's pretty much on my end. I want to pass it on to our Vice Chair, Ricky Tucker.
Thanks, Leticia. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, well, thank you again. Chairwoman Elizabeth and Vice Chair David, first I'd like to share an update. I'm very happy to share that I assume a new role with the Wireless Infrastructure Association, WIA, under the leadership of Jonathan Edelstein. I joined WIA as their Chief Technology Officer. I was representing MMTC, as you know, earlier at the BDAC, but since much of this work on the skills gap and training working group was completed under that role, I'm presenting this final report with Leticia here, and thank you, FCC, for making that possible. With that, I'd like to thank you, Elizabeth and David, for your leadership, time, and dedication for this on this committee. Also like to thank, and when I say I, actually, it's for on behalf of our entire working group, like to thank the wonderful staff at the FCC, Justin, Belinda, Zach, Elizabeth, Jordan Murray, sorry if I miss anyone. And I shared my thoughts earlier with the team, but I want to again reiterate that you made the process barrier-free for us and smooth for all the chairs and working groups. So appreciate all your hard work here as well. And finally, thanks to our working group members and subgroup leaders. I also want to give special recognition to two of our working group members who are present here, who are part of the main BDAC, and that is Eve and Doug. For your contribution, time, and dedication for making sure that we reach to the finish line here on time. And last but not least, I'd like to thank Chairman Pai for his leadership and vision behind the creation of BDAC. Many thanks to Commissioner Carr. We just heard from him. He has always been champion of workforce needs for our industry. And we knew this, that prior to COVID-19 pandemic, our industry was facing workforce shortages and unavailability of standardized training programs, and things were in motion, and there are many initiatives going on, but because of pandemic, many slowed down. So we also want to appreciate the Disaster Response and Recovery Working Group who presented earlier. And we noticed that you all acknowledge the need for investment going into workforce-related concerns. Really happy to see that recommendation in that report as well. And one more thing I'd like to mention before we go to the next slide, and this is a reiteration from my presentation last time in July. I mentioned that our industry not only survived the Great Recession, but thrived during that time in the 2008, 9, 10 timeframe. And that was mainly thanks to our network operators and network builders and integrators in investing in 4G deployments and upgrading the cables and wireless networks as well. This time, it's 5G, which is going to help us go to the other side. And our recommendations are actually coming at the very right time so that hopefully when we work on implementing this, and we need all of your help. So if we do this, we don't have to face the worker shortage for our next generation of technologies, whether it's 6G or any other technology improvements in cable, wireless, ISPs, or fiber side of it. So with that, let's continue our presentation. Letitia, do you mind moving to the next slide, please? Thank you. So just like every time, we just wanted to highlight some of the key updates from last quarter or since we met. And I'd like to focus on the last bullet point first. This is a recently published report by the National Spectrum Consortium. We know that broadband and 5G in particular will open up a lot of workforce-related opportunities. And this report suggests that nearly 4.6 million jobs will be created due to 5G and related economy. So this working group has worked really hard in identifying those obstacles and challenges we face now and how we can solve it systematically. So we really appreciate everybody's contribution and hope all the BDAC members take these lessons learned back to that their organizations and implement some of these recommendations. The job market, of course, we know it's still struggling and there is a lot of uncertainty. So we don't want to just stick to any particular number of unemployment here, but we want to handle this systematically. And of course, we are looking at many data coming from US DOL on a regular basis, but we also want to acknowledge many amazing initiatives DOL has taken through different grants program and contract programs to support and underline these efforts. Some of the recommendations are also touching on the need of providing more attention to the workforce and training needs for our industry. And one such effort we are actually highlighting here, and that is on August 12th, a diverse coalition of industry organizations and associations sent this letter to Congress. You can see their names here, WIA, CTIA, NAB, NATE, CCA, and it was a nicely drafted letter. We need more initiatives like this to highlight the need of properly trained and skilled workforce to handle the huge amount of work our industry is undertaking right now. So we have started to get definitely more recognized because of many efforts like this. Next slide, please, Letitia. And one such highlight also happened literally a month ago, we want to share, and that is U.S. Department of Labor awarded WIA with this major contract to perform as the 5G industry intermediary. And this is an important recognition. Under this contract, WIA will continue the amazing work through TIRAP, which is our industry's the only apprenticeship program, and WIA is the national sponsor of TIRAP, as we all know. And part of the goal, there are many goals around that, but mainly to assist employers in developing over 600 apprentices each year. We reported a grant WIA received earlier this year, and want to highlight the partnership WIA is creating with several community colleges. We heard Commissioner Carr mention earlier that community colleges can play a very important role here. This 5 community colleges we are working with through this grant program, and WIA will help revise and create new curriculum to incorporate telecom and wireless related technical instructions for these colleges. So on a personal note, I'm very proud to be part of this work at WIA. So I'd like to actually pause here and ask Jonathan if you'd like to provide some remarks at this point about this contract and how DOL is recognizing this.
Well, thank you, Dr. Thacker. Thanks to Tisha as well for the great work on this. You know, Dr. Thacker's now in the industry, he developed our program that has been received so well by industry. And he, you know, is a legend in the industry. All of you know him now because you are, of course, seeing the product of his work and the great work of Leticia Latino and the entire working group. But we are thrilled to bring you on, Rickon, as our new Chief Technology Officer. And of course, MMTC is gonna miss you. I'm sure we have partners with them. I hope they're not too angry at me. But your experience in diversity issues will serve us well, because we have committed as part of this to create 50% of our apprentices being from underrepresented communities. So that's a big commitment, but it's something we believed in it for a long time at WIA, and I know that you have the background and experience to help us get there. And this contract also enabled us to hire Brent Weil, who's fairly legendary in the workforce development space as a Vice President of Workforce Development. So new CTO, new VP, but maybe, you know, when you look at this development, it has to be in the context of this working group, because DOL recognized 5G for the first time in their request for proposals on that contract. And that was after you had noted, and as a matter of fact, your study that was earlier put out by this working group had noted the issues and was something that we had brought to the attention of DOL. The White House had taken attention. The FCC, of course, had made sure that that was well recognized across the government. So thanks to the work here, now we have a major infusion of funding and investment by the federal government in apprenticeships in our industry, which is something you've recommended. And now, you know, we have Brendan Carr, who's shown unparalleled leadership on jobs and has been working with us in DOL for a long time to get that recognition. And it was so refreshing to hear him say today, you know, as Congress looks at this, we need to think about how we accordion the workforce in order to meet the demands that would be created by any major investments that Congress would make. No more accordion, I promise. You know, that's it. Unless you pay union scale, no more concerts here. But you know, the fact is that we're going to need that investment, and that investment needs to go into our employers. We want to incent employers to do apprenticeships, and as this report indicates, that's proven way of getting it done for the workforce, giving them pathways to career development. Certainly, you know, I think Commissioner Carr recognized, and we have to recognize that you're going to pour $100 billion in investment into an industry that's already doing $30 billion a year in private sector capital expenditure and already has too tight of a labor market without the skills that it needs. We better make sure that Congress also invests in the workforce to meet the demand that's created by these massive investments. And I expect that they will. We'll certainly be advocating that. This report suggests that. So we certainly thank you, Dr. Thacker, for this great report. Leticia, so glad to have you with WIA and so thankful to all of you who worked on this report.
Thanks, Jonathan. Appreciate it. I see Doug has a hand up. Doug, do you want to add something at this point?
Yeah. I just wanted to. This seemed like the logical place to mention this, based on the work that you, Dr. Thacker, and Letitia, and the rest of this working group did. I mentioned this in a BDAC meeting earlier this year, but I just wanted to update everybody. The New York State Wireless Association, which is the organization through which I'm on this committee, recently entered into a scholarship program with the State University of New York system, and we've awarded our first set of scholarships to students, all of whom are at a community college level, but it's open to any level within the state system. So we are looking forward to working with you all at WIA and the rest of the industry, because we're going to look at apprenticeships and internships for member companies to really continue to expand. But we put our money where our mouth has been. So I just wanted to let everybody know we're very excited about that.
Thank you, Doug. That's really fantastic. I'd love to know more about that. Okay. No, thank you, Jonathan, again. And Letitia, I think the next slide, we have important data to represent as well. Do you want to take on that? Letitia, I cannot hear you.
Hi, Letitia. Are you on mute?
I'm sorry. I don't know what. Yeah, what? I don't know how I can mute myself. Oh my God. I'm sorry about that. Okay, and I'm not sharing. Is he still sharing? Yes, he's still sharing. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Thank you, Ricky. Okay, and so I want to, before I continue, I would thank you, Doug, for your comments and for your contribution to this working group. You've been amazing. And also, I want to take a moment and thank Jonathan for your incredible leadership. I look up to you and all the amazing work that you do, and how you connect the dots as well. As a member of the wireless industry, it's really inspirational to see the way you work. And you said it previously in one of the other presentations. You said we are poised for unprecedented investment, and that I think that we have to stick with that. We start seeing, you know, this money that DOL just allocated, WIA, is going to flow down the pipeline. And now we need to produce the apprentices, because if we say we need these resources and we don't use them and use them efficiently, then we lose the traction and the attention we have gathered. So again, thank you so much for all you do. So moving right along, we also wanted to highlight an employer warfare survey that Nate just finished, and it's Nate, formerly the National Association of Tower Erectors, recently rebranded as the Communications Infrastructure Contractors Association. And my company is a member of both WIA and Nate, so I'm familiar with both, and I want to take the opportunity to also give a shout out to its CEO, Todd Schleckaway. Hopefully I pronounce it correctly, because also they have had incredible leadership in trying to understand what the needs are. And this report is not public yet, but they authorize us to use some of the key points just for the purpose of this presentation. We did not consider it for the purpose of the report, because we are, you know, our scope was broadband, and we really made that, you know, a key point that we're not going to focus only on the wireless side or on the tower side. But when we were allowed to use this data for the purposes of BDAC, which I think shows the collaboration spirit that all the associations are showcasing, it really it drives all our points home. So it's more validation. So there, you know, I invite you to be on the lookout. They're going to release the full report in November, and so we wanted to share some of the key highlights. Keeping in mind that 55% of their membership of their member companies are in the turnkey tower construction business, 38% of them in the wireless antenna and line installation business. So just again, the universe of this survey is way smaller than what the full scope of broadband. But again, we found it useful to share with you. 68% of the interviewed companies cited lack of available workers as their main hiring challenge. So there's no big surprise here. We knew this almost before we even started working on this report. On our first meeting of the working group, everybody participating was saying, all we hear is there are no workers to hire. So here, Nate's survey kind of confirms that. The fact that we need these workers now, it's also confirmed in the fact that 44% said they are always recruiting. So if they find someone willing to work and and qualified to work, they will hire. And that 36% said that they will hire within the 3 to 6 months. So we know that the next year that we're facing, even compounded by the fact of a pandemic, and so we've had very hard to predict situation, we need to be prepared as an industry. We need to start training now and start being aggressive into how are we gonna train workers. One of the most telling responses that we chose to share with you was that when asked, would your company support and be willing to work with educational providers to establish a telecom program in your region, 83% said yes. So people and community colleges want to collaborate with us. I personally can say that I've made like 4 connections from community colleges back into WIA or other associations just by raising awareness at a personal level. So I can only imagine what we can do if we start collaborating and working towards the same goal. Only 21% said they use college career day or job fairs for hiring. It would impress you from the questionnaire to see 68% hire by word of mouth, which again, we knew even before we started to work here. So I think that we have, not only with this report, but through 15 months of interviewing subject matter experts, we have confirmed that the skill gap, it's real, and the lack of qualified workers is real. So very quickly, our working group specifics, we had 7 calls this quarter. Subgroups met via conference call, and I want to take the moment to really acknowledge the work of our subgroup leaders. For the employers, subgroup was led by Bill Esbeck and Eve Lewis. Thank you so much for all your effort. On the workers or students, it was led by Miranda Allen, who was a representative of NATE, but unfortunately left the working group a few months ago, and Rikin. And then on the training institutions, it was also Dr. Naif Abu Aji, which was with the working group up to the last call, and then he transitioned to a new job. So I wanted to really acknowledge their work into leading each subgroup into optimal results. We're going to touch very briefly, for interest of time, on our charge number 5, which was identifying performance metrics, because this is something that we didn't work on until this quarter. We had done some, but it really was a big focus for us on this quarter, and then we'll go through recommendations and report issuance. So again, very quickly, I'm not going to go into, don't get scared. I know we're all hungry, so I'm not going to go into all these metrics, but the way we tackle charge number 5, and you can read it on the report in more detail, we still use the 3 lenses or 3 glasses of our stakeholders, and we try to identify the metrics that were important for each stakeholder. And that was important to us, then establish a key indicator on how we were going to measure the performance. And then it was important to define how we're going to continue to improve that metric in the future. So that's the basis of what the working groups did. What you're seeing is we divided into institution and programs. where matriculation, contextualized learning of development skills, completion, cost, and equity were the defined metrics. Then for learners and graduates, we defined it as employment, as a obviously as an important performance metrics, and what percentage of graduates employed within 6 months of graduation, and then the employment retention, because churning was a term that we heard very often in our SMEs meetings. So we tried, how do we reduce the retention, how do we improve retention of the employees, and how, then the measurement thereof. So then for the employers side, we obviously made a particular emphasis on recruitment costs, because a lot of them, and that's highlighted somewhere in the NATE study, so you can check it out next month when it comes out, but you can see that most companies, at least on that universe of companies, do their training in-house. And I think that's pretty standard, and that's why it's so prohibited to train someone that then is going to leave a few months down the road. And that's really, confirms why there's a shortage to begin with. Then you want to track the skills gains, and that upskilling that we keep talking about. For this to be a real and true career path, you have to make sure that you provide a way to increase the skills the employee has along the road, productivity, turnover, and employee earnings. So those were the metrics that we define are important to the employer. So in terms of our charge file, we feel very satisfied with the way this came along in table format, and we also double check with some of the SMEs and some colleges that participated along the process, and we double check with them. So it was a really collaborative effort where we proposed some, and they share with us how they were tracking already. So we feel pretty confident that we have embedded what's being done so far, and we have also proposed new performance metrics that could be very telling moving forward. And of course, how we are able to transfer these performance metrics to the industry will be a big differentiator, because eventually, if everybody starts measuring the same things, that's when we will have meaningful data that we can act upon, rather than having each community college have different metrics. So that kind of closes our chat on our charge number 5. You all have seen the report structure by now. Probably you all read the report. We just putting it out here because of how we structure the report. The only new thing probably that you hadn't seen was that charge number 5 performance metrics table. For the rest, we feel very confident that the proposed recommendations that we have put in front of you were shared in its high-level form during our past presentations. So there shouldn't have been surprises in terms of what this working group was going to bring up today for approval. So moving into our final recommendations. The first challenge, and I'm going to probably you all noticed this, but we tried to focus our challenges in 7 big, let's say, pillars, and we tried to lump them, so that we didn't end up with 15 different challenges. And so the recommendations are presented in the same way. For the broadband brand identity crisis that we've been kind of shouting from the very beginning, there's a crisis, and we need to do something more to bring the broadband brand front and center. We propose the we promote the formation of or addition to a coalition of broadband-related trade associations to jointly advance workforce development initiatives and to centralize and coordinate industry efforts. And the exciting part here is, even if it sounds like, wow, we're going to form another coalition, we are doing this already, and this is why we keep highlighting all these coalitions. Ricken highlighted one today that took a letter to Congress. We highlighted 3 in our report and in other presentations. So this is already going on almost organically. And so what we are proposing is to formalize it. And all these associations are already collaborating with each other, already talking to each other. It's just a matter of seeing what's the best way forward. Do we form a new one, or we adhere to one that is existing, but it has to have the mission of advancing workforce development for the broadband industry. And so the 4 action items that will have from the get-go would be to create a centralized clearinghouse of all things related to broadband workforce. Basically, that one point of go-to when we as an industry member get asked, where do I find more about it? I know I get people excited about our work industry, and I said this on our last presentation, like, there's jobs and people ask me, where do I find more? And I don't know exactly where to send them. So this will fix that, creating potentially a website to enable unified messaging and a single and consistent point of information dissemination for our workforce. Number 2 would be to develop and implement an outreach strategy to promote our jobs and career paths for potential workers and students. Every career fair that gets done in the country could have the same messaging with the same one-page flyer. It doesn't have to be a lot of work, but it has to be consistent. And this is how you tackle on the rural aspect of our charges, is we have to include everybody, and the message we have to send has to reach everybody. Number 3, invite representatives of the 3 stakeholders groups to join the coalition. We don't want only one segment. We want the employers. We want the community colleges. We want the actual workers to tell us what's going on. That's the way this really works, when you have everybody's opinion and everybody's perspective considered. And then this one is important, obviously, we discussed it extensively before. Promote the creation of job codes recognized by the U.S. Department of Labor that relate specifically to broadband industry jobs, and help ensure that academic institutions, employers, and workers are educated and aware about advances made on this front. We all need to talk the same language when it relates to our workforce jobs. So this is a particularly crucial point. So with that, I'll pass it to Rikin for recommendations number 2. But one thing that I want to emphasize is all our recommendations throughout the report, we try to be very actionable. So it's really things to do. You know, we have to be done talking at some point, and we have to get doing. Otherwise, we're going to miss a window of opportunity. And so all the other recommendations could really span out from this first one. Once there's a coalition or a group that's going to agree on all these points, all the other recommendations could be easily implemented. So Rikin, back to you.
Thanks, Leticia. Yeah, so we have 6 more challenges and relevant recommendations or solutions tied with them. So on number 2 here, we are trying to connect 2 problems here. One is the lack of standardized training, and the other one is lack of programs that are available nationwide. So we are noticing that there is a lack of availability and offering of training programs geared towards the broadband deployment workforce. And of course, individual employers, they have their own in-house programs, but they are geared towards their own products or services. And also they're meant mainly for their already hired employees. So we recommend undertaking a targeted outreach initiative to ensure that the training programs are being implemented not only at this employer level, but we encourage that they go both in the promotion needs to actually go in both rural and urban areas equally through other partnerships with community colleges or other degree granting universities as well. Some of the recommendations we mentioned, we want to highly encourage that employers and training providers, they need to come together through some sort of summits, right now virtual, but later on in person, and mainly align their initiatives and goals so that they can understand employers' need and the training providers can align their programs to meet their requirements. Also, we want to foster these partnerships between industry and training providers. We know that some of the successful programs are already out there. Again, WIS, Telecommunication Education Center, we highlighted this since day one, and DOL's recent award and recognition is a great sign. But we need more examples like this. This also means that we need more funding and recognition by other federal agencies as well, just like how DOL just started. And we also suggest that we get engage in the rapid development of curriculum for the higher education and training institution as well, because sooner we can get the young generation excited about our industry, I think that's going to help us all. So moving on to the next slide, number 3. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I'm getting some background noise here. Let's see. Okay. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, I think you may need to mute your microphone. I think we're getting some background noise.
Oh, thank you. On number 3, we are addressing the not only lack of federal or state funding, but also unawareness, because in some cases, in some states, this kind of funding does exist, but then we need to make sure that our employers and other training provider or institutions of higher education, they are aware of this. So we have also identified 2 separate categories in this one as well. One, funding from federal or state agencies, and second, investment by the employers. So even though we featured the grant and the recent contract by DOL to WIA, but overall, historically, if you look at it, the funding for our industries has been very low. This is just a start. Millions of dollars each year being allocated for apprenticeships and other programs for other industry segments. And we want to encourage the federal agencies to funnel more into our industry, telecom and broadband in general. And from employers' point of view, there is not sufficient awareness regarding the return on investment, if you think of that way, particularly investing into registered apprenticeship programs. If they realize that how these programs are beneficial and how ultimately it adds to their bottom line, they will get more excited. So we again encourage initiatives like TIREP, through which employers can actually learn more value in investing in apprenticeship programs and becoming part of it. And the other side of the employer is that they do allocate funding for continuing education, but that is still geared towards graduate programs, such as paying for their college tuition for MBAs and such, but not so much money is allocated for professional training. So that is another recommendation we weaved into our report here. So we recommend that the stakeholders need to be educated, and we need to raise this awareness around funding vehicles and grant agencies with potential to benefit the broadband workforce development. And the second bullet point is pretty important. I think a number of times we mentioned earlier, Jonathan also alluded to this earlier. We request this, that congressionally approved $80 billion budget to deploy broadband infrastructure, mainly for the unserved and underserved communities. Part of this actually gets geared towards infrastructure workforce training needs as well. On next slide, recommendation number 4. We addressed this in our July meeting as well, the lack of standardized wages and universal credentialing issue. So we understand that in order to recruit and retain high quality and skilled employees, it's necessary for employers to offer competitive wages and benefit packages. But our pay rates for our industry are not standardized. We all know that problem exists. And in many cases, we call it broadband industry, but within that, we have wireless, wireline, fiber, wireless ISPs, etc. And many of the segments use the same job title, but they have different job descriptions and along with that different salary and packages as well. On top of that, the pay and travel requirements are also not as competitive compared to other industry segments such as IT and cloud industry, etc. You see all these valid recommendations here, and I like to particularly highlight the last one. We need to educate the local workforce and economic development boards on how these broadband jobs and job codes are being applied in the system so that the funding opportunities can be made more readily available for our workforce and other players as well. So many of these recommendations actually go to address this lack of standardized wages and credentialing of skilled workers. On number 5, this is definitely unique to our industry. It's a reality, but also a challenge in attracting more workers. Many of our jobs are field jobs, and they are coupled with on-the-road duties and some very unique demands. Also, weather and climate make some of these jobs seasonal, that's how it's perceived actually. And certain areas of the country are not accessible because of the weather conditions. So all this is actually adding to our overall confusion or challenges, I would say. And also, many of our jobs require working at the heights, and that is pretty unique as well. And we have this high liability component that is adding contractual demands among stakeholders as well. So we addressed this last time in July, and we have made some recommendations here. Letitia, do you want to add something here with respect to our recommendations on this particular challenge? Letitia, you're on mute.
I'm sorry, Ricky. I'm not muting myself. I guess they are muting me. That's fine, but that's why I'm like, okay.
No worries.
And it's not that straightforward to go from the presentation. I'm so sorry. All right. So yeah, sure. Thank you, Ricky, for that. Do you see my screen?
No, we see your.
Oh, my email. I'm sorry. I'm trying to. I don't know. This is making jokes with me. Okay, now you see it.
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. So all your points, I think you did a great job with this slide. I was saying when I was on mute that on this section, our report trying to highlight things that are obviously of importance to a lot of the companies executing the services, but that they're not like, we couldn't name it like one skill, one reason, like the commercial driver's license. I don't know how many times that came up with our subject matters expert. And so it's a hard thing to then present in a report or a solution because it's very unique, as Ricken said. The failing the drug tests because the levels were very high, very low in what they were requested. That's something that came up also on the NATE survey, as a lot of companies have a right candidate in terms of skills, but they cannot hire it because of the requirements that are pretended by the final, the carriers or the companies doing the hiring. So also, I'm very passionate, those of you that know me personally, about the, I have a small business compared to, we do services for carriers, but we are tiny when you talk T-Mobile or Verizon or one of your potential customers. And one of the things that also caught my eye on the data that Nate undercovered, it's their universe of companies. 87% of the companies that answered the survey are less than 75 employees. Those are the people doing the actual work. These are not big companies. Our 5G networks, no matter, I know there's the Mastex and the big guys, but they go and hire the small guys to eventually get it done. And we've spoken about this, but again, I think it's a super important point. When you have the big carriers impose extremely demanding conditions commercially, and then it gets pushed down to that 87% of companies doing the work. At some point, they're going to say, listen, to fulfill all these requirements, all these insurances, all these things that I have to do, this is too much money. It's not worth it. So that is definitely something that we have to look at in terms of how we get this solved. And what we propose is to explore the creation of a governmentally organized small and minority business owners program, specifically classified within the broadband deployment context, wherein smaller size contractor company in good standing could access group insurance, financing, and general commercial terms at a more beneficial rate if they commit to training new technicians, for example. And as a personal note, I commend again, I'm sorry, Jonathan, to have WIA all over this, but I had a meeting with someone, with team from WIA on this, on how do we help diverse companies, which I'm a women-owned company, and I'm fighting all these issues. So, and they already have good ideas as to how we come as an industry and try to put programs together to help solve this. Once we solve these, small companies like mine and others will do hiring very happily, because then you see a future for the workforce you're putting together. So back to you for recommendations number 6, Ricken.
Yes, thank you. And on this one, this is definitely a reality we presented, but mainly we know in general, some numbers we presented last time, that entire generation, this baby boomer generation we address, and then 73 million numbers we presented last time. But I want to connect this, and then our group agreed to that. For our industry, this is actually a big challenge. If you think about it, you cannot actually wait for somebody to, for employers I'm talking about, that they would say, okay, well, if somebody retires, I'm going to fill that position at that time. No, because many of our jobs require on-the-job training. Some of the jobs actually require a couple of, or more than a couple of years to get proficient into that job. And it's not just simply the field jobs. These are RF engineering and field deployment and design and planning. Many other jobs are like that. So we have this dwindling workforce, and that is a reality. So we have to start working on this now. There are many solutions we are proposing under this, but mainly our focus should be on reskilling and investing in the training programs. We like to highlight some of the recently announced initiatives by many of our big players, and I want to highlight Verizon here, AT&T and Comcast, and a number of other players who are investing into reskilling programs, and those are fantastic, and we need to actually tie that to the community level as well. Also, we need to see more presence from all of our employer friends and employer companies on campuses, campus recruitments. Even if you want to hire just an intern or so, I would highly recommend, and we suggest this, please attend those career fairs. If we see more booths on the floor by telecom companies, the students will actually get more excited, and they will understand that how lucrative our industry has been, and those one-on-one discussions, I think, would help. I know these are all grassroots level suggestions, but we have to implement them now. And also our current workforce, we need to keep them motivated and engaged. We are losing some really good talents to other industries, and we need to actually do a good job in keeping our existing workforce motivated, so we don't see this churn rate that. We need to actually also understand that, take this opportunity, and we are highlighting this. Let's actually open up and increase the diversity in our workforce. We need more employees and apprentices and interns from underrepresented communities, minority communities, veterans, women. We need to actually expand at all fronts. So these are some of the high-level recommendations you'll find in the report under number 6. And finally, on number 7, we know, right? I mean, there are so many challenges, so many unseen or unforecasted scenarios we have to deal with. But let's just be ready for the new environment and many unknowns now. We mentioned that our industry has continued the deployment and maintenance throughout this pandemic, and the need for the broadband and recognition we are getting is unprecedented. However, there are still some reports of layoffs and furloughs for many of our workers, either associated with the retail stores, sales, customer-facing field services, etc. So we need to actually do more at this point and try to actually retain that workforce and invest into reskilling right now. Even though the teaching and curriculum development are in the top 3 skills in demand right now, this is actually one of the surveys we found. I think this was done by Microsoft and LinkedIn. But the point here is that this teaching and curriculum development is one of the key skills in demand, and we need to actually tap into that, use this momentum, and create more opportunities with the community colleges and local universities, so that they can also see the support from our industry as well. Many of the common recommendations you can see, they are very valid under the current scenario. We need to immediately launch this aggressive outreach initiative. As Letitia said, #1 recommendation of brand identity crisis. I think this is tied with that. And also we need to actively promote Department of Labor approved apprenticeship programs among all the stakeholders, and that would actually enable us recruit diverse workforce as well. And finally, again, going back to that branding piece, consider ways to create the branding for our industry and increase the awareness as well. So these are actually high-level recommendations we want to present here. Much detailed description is available in our report, of course. You all would have read it by now. On the next slide, right, thank you. Our working group did a fantastic job early on. We wanted to actually, before we provide these recommendations, we wanted to understand what exists in the marketplace, what programs are already out there, how they worked. Some of them failed, actually, some of them needed upgrade. So we look at many programs, and our group decided to take this 15 and feature them in our report. So there is a separate section where we try to summarize key highlights from each of these 15 programs, some of their strengths, where they are located, links to their websites for you to explore more. But this is something we are really proud of, and this is a good compilation in our report. All right, and I think moving to the next slide, and Letitia, I think you will take it back from that.
Okay, you hear me? They unmute me. Okay, you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry. Thank you for muting me. Thank you, Ricky. So at this point, you did a fantastic job with all our recommendations. Thank you so much. Besides the fact that you saw how many programs we really evaluated in detail, we also want to acknowledge at this point all the SMEs. We have 2 slides worth of them, so I cannot name them all, but I'm going to leave a few seconds this one. And we had participation from all sorts of stakeholders. We had employers, we had government officials, we have training institutions. So definitely we feel very confident that the data we are presenting here today is backed up by extreme research by our entire working group in all these hours and hours of conversations that we had. And so I want to acknowledge each and every one of them because they were very generous with their time and their contribution to our working group report. So the good news is you see conclusion, and I can see the smile in your face at this point. I think that we all align in what the message is. At the end of the day, we know, because we're part of the industry, that our broadband technologies will only continue to evolve, both wireless and wireline. That this is only the beginning, because 5G is a disruptive technology and it's touching all segments of the broadband ecosystem. And really what fuels 5G, if it doesn't have a fiber backbone, we cannot realize its true power. So that's why there's this massive investment being budgeted, because our government knows that this is the important thing. So preparing for it and training for it and having the right workforce for it, it's crucial. And as we always say, and Commissioner Carr and Chairman, I always say, there's a global race for leadership. We are winning it, but we have to sustain it. We can really not, get distracted and not get the workforce prepared. So obviously there's a huge concern that do we have the workers we need or not? We do have the people that we can train, and it will give the young people a fantastic career path. This is the part I get personally excited when I tell someone about apprenticeship, or I tell someone how in 12 weeks, your son can be making $50,000, in the broadband industry. And I see other moms say, they don't believe me. This is the part where we need to start being more involved. So the force is in the union, as the saying says. So it's critical that we all get together, a private and public industry, trade associations, federal, state, and local governments, all their agencies, and that we maximize what, for example, the Department of Labor does, and that we maximize the funding vehicles that are there. I personally learned so much for my own business about things I had no clue existed. And these are programs designed to help us. So, well, I'm obviously messing up a little bit today with the presentation. Are you all there?
We are.
And you see, I'm sorry, I don't know. Do you see my screen still?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. I don't know what's going on with me today, but we're almost at the end. So, so I guess the point here is that we have a unique opportunity, and what we can be doing meanwhile, it's while we all get ready for what's coming and seeing if these funds get approved, and if we get a piece of it, we have to continue the industry engagement for rebranding. We have to do what Chairman Pai does, what all the trade associations are doing, Department of Labor. If you see a tweet about workforce, just retweet it. Just become an active agent of creating a strong workforce, because it can make a difference. And we have a unique opportunity coming up, because we have Apprenticeship Week coming up, and you can find all the information about it at the Department of Labor webpage. And they have a great set of tools. They have a pledge you can take as a private company, that you pledge to support apprenticeship. It doesn't mean you're committing to anything. You just like the idea and you think it's a great vehicle. And I think this is something that we can all, put the word out there. It's, again, you have the link there, and it's coming up in November. So that's a great first step. And so the last message our working group wants to give is the time is now. We have the opportunity to build a highly skilled, highly trained, forward-thinking, diverse, and broad workforce. That's all on our end. Thank you very much for your attention. Madam Chair, I give it up to you to open for discussion.
Thank you very much. It's a great presentation and a lot of work. Appreciate everything that's gone into it. And at that point, I will open the floor for questions, comments, or thoughts. Let's see.
Madam Chair, before we say anything, I just want to quickly add to what Letitia mentioned. On the National Apprenticeship Week, we'd highly recommend that you visit their website, because on the website you will see the map of US, and you can actually find your desired location and identify which other entities are active and hosting events during this week. Not to put any plug or anything like that, but at WIA we hosted a webinar last week just about the workforce And that was also featured in this National Apprenticeship Week website. Well, we will actually issue a recording of that webinar, I think, very soon. So I highly recommend people who are interested in learning more about apprenticeship and how that can help telecom industry in general, please go ahead and watch that as well. And lastly, want to mention that appreciate Letitia for her leadership as well, and making sure that, you know, every other week and we meet regularly, but she took thorough notes, kept everybody on track. So Letitia, appreciate your leadership on this as well.
Thank you, Rick, and it's been a great experience. So same for you.
Thank you.
Thank you. David Young.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Letitia, Rick, and fantastic work from your group. I can't say enough. I did want to call out specifically in your report one thing I thought was especially important. Subsection E, all the way at the bottom, performance metrics for job skills and training program. The fact that the working group went through and created this metric for how we should measure the performance of the programs we're looking to fund, I think is especially important. And I really was extremely pleased that you would put that level of thought and detail into your report. I just wanted to give my thanks and gratitude to all the members of your working group for the excellent amount of work that went into this. It really is fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That's very much appreciated. Thank you very much. And we are very happy if it starts proving useful right away.
So while we're waiting to see if there are other comments, we have one procedural issue, which is that this is scheduled for a vote tomorrow. If a member wants to vote on this report today, we can do that, but we need to basically agree that we want to do that. It just needs to be a quorum. We have a quorum. Is there anyone opposed to voting on this today, assuming that's the decision of the group? Okay. Not hearing any opposition to that, assuming that we want to vote at all, we will do the vote today. And I'm not hearing other comments. I'm going to give one last call for anyone who would like to jump in and make a comment. And if none, I'm going to ask for a motion to approve the report.
I move to approve the report. Great report.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Elizabeth, I'll second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. I would ask that everybody vote yay or nay in the chat window.
Elizabeth, Jane raised her hand. I want to make sure you saw that.
I did not. Thank you. We will. Go ahead, Jane. Go ahead. Jane Builder.
It was a mistake, a fat.
Okay. Has everyone voted? Trying to see.
Are you accepting mail-in ballots tomorrow?
I am, and for the next, no. Mail-in ballots through November 3rd. So this is looking good. I think everyone has voted. If not, please feel free to continue to vote. I want to thank everybody for all of the amazing work, and specifically for the record to state that the final working groups were put together in July, and these groups pulled out amazing work in a phenomenally short period of time. And I could not be prouder of the work that this group has done. And thank you so much for making me look good, for making the BDAC look good, and for producing some very amazing work that I think is going to make a real difference. So heartfelt thank you to all of you. And we will, I will open it for any general comments or questions we may have before we adjourn.
Yeah, just before we go with that, Elizabeth, it looks like everyone has voted by my count, and it is unanimous. So congratulations.
Congratulations.
Very good work.
Yay. So while people are deciding if they have last comments, I will do a little bit of housekeeping. We had 3 working groups, 2 reports up and voted out in October. 1 report that is nearly finalized that's going to go back for some more work and additional rounding out. Basically, though, I would say predominantly complete, and we will be planning on voting on that in December at the December meeting. So look out for the revised report about 30 days before whatever the date is of the December meeting, which I'm going to guess, and I'm totally a guess, is going to be somewhere in the second week of December just because of Thanksgiving and Christmas. So that's my thought, at least. So again, I want to thank everybody for the great work and congratulations to all of the working groups. And that is it. We are adjourned.
Thank you, Elizabeth.